Oberyn Martell felt the heat of the sun on his shoulders and the fullness of his rage coiling in his belly as he stood in the center of the arena, spear in hand. The sky overhead was a brilliant blue, and the stands were packed with lords and ladies, knights and commoners alike. The Red Viper of Dorne had always been a man who savored spectacle, who knew how to bend attention toward himself. But never before had he faced a moment so starkly decisive as this one. Tyrion Lannister stood nearby in chains, his life hanging on the outcome of the trial by combat. Nearby, Lord Tywin Lannister sat stone-faced, unreadable, while Cersei Lannister's lips were curved in that dangerous half-smile that Oberyn had come to know and despise. Prince Oberyn could also see Mace Tyrell's broad, anxious face in the crowd, alongside the narrowed eyes of his daughter Marjorie. There was tension in every corner of the courtyard beneath the Red Keep, tension that Oberyn planned to shatter with blood and vengeance. They called him the Red Viper for many reasons: his cunning, his swiftness, his venomous barbs, but also for the coil of emotion that lurked beneath his polished surface, ready to strike. He had come to King's Landing in search of justice for the murder of his sister, Elia Martell, and her children. He had come for vengeance against Gregor Clegane, the monstrous mountain that rides. And now here stood that mountain in the flesh, an enormous man clad in heavy plate, helm shaped like a snarling beast. The man's voice was a deep growl, echoing through the space. Gregor's eyes, visible through the slits, gave nothing but cruelty away. Oberyn could feel his own pulse thrumming in his ears, and he steadied himself with a slow exhalation. The crowd was silent, anticipating the moment of bloodshed to come. The moment the fight was signaled to begin, Oberyn advanced, spear glinting in the midday sun. He had always moved with lethal grace, each step deliberate, each shift of weight carefully measured. Against a man like Gregor Clegane, size and brute strength were worthless if one could be fast. Oberyn intended to be the wind around this hulking beast, to be the whirlwind that stripped him of life. He had trained for this, not just for days or weeks, but for years, fueled by a hatred so old it had hardened into a steel spine in his soul. He circled, challenging Gregor with a pointed swirl of his spear. "You murdered her," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "You killed Elia Martell and her children. Say it." The words were an incantation of fury that had burned on his lips since he first chose Tyrion Lannister's champion. Gregor swung a massive sword in a heavy arc, the blade too large for a normal man to wield with any grace. But the mountain was no normal man. Oberyn sidestepped swiftly, the steel biting only air. Again Oberyn's voice rang out. "Say her name, Elia Martell of Dorne. Say it." The crowd took in a collective breath, riveted by the cat-and-mouse dance. Even so, Oberyn sensed the underlying arrogance in Gregor's stance. The mountain believed himself unstoppable. He believed he had nothing to fear from a smaller, quicker man. But Oberyn Martell had come prepared. He had tested his poisons, honed his reflexes, all to ensure that Gregor would fall this day. Another heavy swing from Gregor came crashing downward, this time aimed at Oberyn's legs. The Red Viper leapt back, twisting with inhuman speed, and while Gregor recovered from the momentum of that huge blow, Oberyn thrust his spear forward. The tip scored across Gregor's thigh, slicing through the gap in his plate as easily as a knife through cheese. Though the wound was not immediately deadly, it bled, and the crowd gasped. Blood on the sand, proof that the massive knight was mortal, and that Oberyn was lethal. Gregor let out a roar of rage as he shifted his stance, apparently trying to put weight on his wounded leg. Oberyn circled again, continuing the incessant chant. "You raped her. You murdered her. You killed her children." Each accusation was a lash across the mountain's monstrous pride. Oberyn wanted him angry, wanted him reckless, for fury would cloud a fighter's mind, even the mind of one so fearsome as Gregor Clegane. A second blow came, a diagonal slash that ripped through the air. Oberyn slid beneath it, twisting his body and hooking the staff of his spear between Gregor's legs as he passed. He couldn't manage to knock the giant down. The man was too massive, but it caused him to stumble. The crowd roared anew, some with delight, some with fear, and Oberyn felt adrenaline sharpen his senses even further. The world seemed slow to him in that instant, each of Gregor's movements telegraphed by the shift of muscle beneath steel, each thunderous footstep stirring the dust. He had no intention of gloating too soon this time. Oberyn would not be undone by his own pride. He had learned from a lifetime of near misses and from the moment he had first heard of Gregor's atrocities. This was not a time for overconfidence. He recognized that his advantage lay in movement, speed, and the poison he had carefully administered to his spearhead. Yet he did not rely solely on the poison. He was determined to end Gregor with a series of precise strikes, each wounding the giant a bit more. Step after step, Oberyn advanced, retreating only when Gregor's blade threatened. He would lash out with a flurry of blows, thrusts to the joints, slashes at the gaps in armor, always moving, never letting the mountain trap him. A spear that found its mark 3 times for times 5. Gregor bled from his thigh, his arm, a slight puncture near his collar. And then Oberyn, with a sudden flourish, slashed the spear tip across Gregor's midsection, drawing blood in a deeper spurt. A hush fell over the crowd as Gregor faltered. Oberyn, typically flamboyant, let his grin show only for a moment. He had him. He could see the man's massive chest heaving with labored breaths. The poison was no doubt working by now, coursing through Gregor's bloodstream, forcing his heart to labor even more. Oberyn knew the moment to press for a killing blow. With a final, measured exhalation, Oberyn sprung forward like a viper indeed, low to the ground, then rising with the spear pointed upward. Gregor tried to bring his sword down, but Oberyn's strike was too swift, guided by rage, skill, and a desire for justice so fierce it felt like an inferno behind his eyes. The spearhead punched through Gregor's gorget, sliding under his chin in a spray of red. The mountain's roar turned to a gurgle as steel bit flesh, and Oberyn put all his weight into the thrust. The monstrous man staggered, dropping his sword. Then, for a moment, Gregor's huge hands reached out, grappling weakly at the spear shaft before falling to his knees. Finally, as though the entire arena had been holding its breath, he toppled forward into the dirt. A cloud of dust rose around his body, and the crowd exploded in cries of shock and excitement. Oberyn stepped back, spear still clutched in his hand, breath ragged. He glanced down at Gregor. The hulking man twitched once more and then was still, a pool of crimson spreading beneath the battered plates of his armor. All around them, the watchers in the stands came alive with exclamation and uproar. Some shouted in horror that the mountain was felled. Others cheered for the cunning of the Dornish prince. Tyrion Lannister's own face was transfixed in surprise and a dawning mixture of relief and awe. If Gregor was indeed dead, and he was, then Tyrion was proven innocent by trial by combat. Oberyn's eyes scanned for Lord Tywin Lannister. The great lion of House Lannister remained stone-faced, but there was unmistakable fury in the set of his mouth. Cersei Lannister, for her part, looked as though she had been slapped across the face. Her cheeks flamed, her lips parted in shock that she tried to mask with scorn, but could not. Oberyn lifted his spear, calling out, "You have your justice, Tyrion Lannister, as do I." His voice echoed, silencing pockets of the crowd that had still been buzzing with chaos. The Red Viper turned on his heel, took a step forward, and then something within him loosened, as if a knot at the core of his being had finally come undone. The tension of so many years, the nightmares of his beloved sister, ravaged and murdered, finally found some measure of closure. Yet this was only the beginning. He had come for a confession, for an admission of guilt that Gregor would pronounce with his dying breath. He had wanted more than just the mountain's life. He wanted Tywin Lannister's complicity exposed to all. But the mountain's swift death made that impossible. Gregor was beyond speaking now. Still, the mountain was dead, and Oberyn was alive. In the stands, Oberyn heard shouts, "Prince Oberyn! Prince Oberyn!" Some voices were jubilant, others uneasy. Dorne's champion had proven a lethal threat to the Lannisters. But King's Landing was Tywin's territory, and Tywin would not let this go unanswered. Varys, the master of whisperers, watched with an enigmatic expression, as though considering the ramifications on the board of power. Littlefinger's eyes gleamed with calculations, no doubt already planning how to twist this outcome to his advantage. The King's Guard led Tyrion Lannister away from the center of the arena, unchaining him as was required by the victory. Oberyn watched as Tyrion's face flickered through relief, gratitude, and wariness. The imp knew as well as anyone that though the god's judgment had spared his life, the political consequences of such a humiliating outcome for House Lannister could be dire, and Oberyn himself, still riding the wave of adrenaline, felt the weight of what he had just done. He had not only killed one of the mightiest knights in the Seven Kingdoms but also dealt a blow directly to House Lannister's pride. They would not forgive him easily. He approached Tyrion, who stood near the dais, surrounded by spectators. The dwarf inclined his head in thanks. "You have my gratitude, Prince Oberyn. I had begun to lose faith in the gods." Oberyn nodded, the corners of his mouth faintly curving. "You owe me no thanks, my lord. I came for my sister's justice. That your life was spared is a small piece of satisfaction on top of the main course." Tyrion let out a shaky breath. "All the same, my life was in your hands. I know well the cost if you had not triumphed." Before Oberyn could reply, Tywin Lannister's voice cut through the arena, amplified by the hush that was settling once more. "It appears the gods have spoken," Tywin intoned. If Oberyn's spear had been laced with lethal poison, Tywin's words dripped with a sort of poisonous civility. "Tyrion Lannister is hereby found innocent of the crime of regicide by divine trial." For a moment, Oberyn could see the old lion's jaw clench. How he must loathe this outcome. Yet Tywin was a man too controlled to lash out openly here and now. He would smile if necessary, show himself as a gracious lord, and bide his time. Oberyn saw all that in Tywin's cold green eyes. The onlookers began to disperse, some weaving through the stands, others heading out to spread word to the streets of King's Landing. Oberyn stood for a moment, letting the magnitude of his victory sink in, letting the torrent in his heart slow. He felt eyes on him from every corner. Guards, lords, ladies, the small folk. He was the man who slew the mountain, a deed once thought impossible. The tension lingered in the air like a storm cloud. Then the prince turned and strode toward the exit, spear in hand, as though to remind anyone who might entertain foolish notions that he remained armed and dangerous. Only a few hours later, as Oberyn bathed and changed in the lavish apartments granted to him at the Red Keep, the full reality of what he had done began to settle in. He gazed out a tall window at the city sprawled below, the brick and stone rooftops, the labyrinth of streets. King's Landing had always smelled of sour wine, sweat, and waste to him, nothing like the sweet dryness of sun-baked Dorne. Yet here he was, and he had scored a victory over House Lannister. He thought of Valeria, his paramour, somewhere in the keep, no doubt relieved that he had emerged victorious. He thought of the old, simmering hatred in his heart. Would this victory bring him peace? His reflection in the polished metal mirror caught his eye. He saw a man still in the prime of life, dark hair sprinkled with silver near the temples, face bearing the lines of hedonism and heartbreak in equal measure. But there was something new in his gaze now, a sense of vindication, even if incomplete. Gregor had not confessed Tywin's involvement, but perhaps that was a matter best handled through other means. All that had been proven here was Tyrion's innocence, and that Oberyn Martell was far from powerless. His body ached from bruises he hadn't noticed in the heat of combat. The rush of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a certain weariness. He let his mind wander to what might happen next. The Martells would hear of this triumph. Word would spread like wildfire. Doran, his older brother and the Prince of Dorne, would have to move carefully now. Oberyn's victory would both embolden Dorne and unsettle the alliance with the Iron Throne. Or perhaps alliance was too strong a word. Dorne bent the knee, yes, but the scars of Robert's rebellion had never really healed. The rest of the realm might not understand Dorne's thirst for justice, but they would soon learn the price of underestimating it. He thought then of how Tywin might move. The old lion rarely let slights pass without consequence. The death of Gregor Clegane, Tywin's monstrous pet, would wound Lannister prestige. Yet Tywin could not overtly punish Oberyn without calling down the wrath of all Dorne upon him. Precarious balance. Oberyn suspected that the Master of Coin, Peter Baelish, or the Master of Whisperers, Varys, would soon come sniffing about with suggestions or secret deals. Everyone in King's Landing always tried to turn a crisis into an opportunity. By the time the sun had dipped beneath the horizon, Oberyn had dressed in flowing Dornish robes of deep crimson and gold embroidery, a subtle reminder of his moniker. He gathered Ellaria Sand at his side and made his way down the corridors of the Red Keep, guards escorting them with a nervous tension. The flickering torchlight revealed the high stone walls hung with banners of the Seven Kingdoms, but the gold lion of Lannister loomed especially large. He could almost sense the lion watching him as he passed. In the great hall, a subdued atmosphere reigned. King Tommen, just a boy, sat awkwardly on the Iron Throne, his feet not quite reaching the floor, while court functionaries milled about. It was no secret that Tywin Lannister ran the realm behind his grandson's figurehead. Oberyn could feel the old lion's presence, though he did not see him at first. A pair of Kingsguards stood rigid by the dais. Oberyn's arrival caused a ripple of murmurs. He offered a short bow to the boy king, mindful of courtesy, but said nothing. The hush parted, and out stepped Cersei Lannister, her green eyes flashing. "Prince Oberyn, so glad you remain in good health," she said, voice dripping with false sweetness. Her anger simmered beneath the surface, though she was forced to maintain a veneer of decorum. An impressive display against Ser Gregor. He was quite the formidable opponent. Oberyn inclined his head, though not deeply enough to truly show submission. "Your Grace, I trust you were entertained. No doubt the spectacle will be the talk of the city for days to come." One corner of Cersei's mouth twitched. "Indeed," she said softly. "Days to come." He read the threat easily. Tywin's brood had never been subtle in their hostility. While Joffrey had been the worst in that regard, Cersei had her own brand of menace. Oberyn only smiled, letting her words roll off him like water off a desert stone. If the Lannisters thought they could intimidate him with glances and insinuations, they were mistaken. He had faced the mountain. He had emerged triumphant. They would need subtler methods or more direct ones if they wished to truly harm the Red Viper. Ellaria's hand tightened on Oberyn's arm, her dark eyes scanning the hall. He knew she sensed the hostility. She whispered in his ear, "We should depart, my prince. There is nothing more here for us tonight." Oberyn gave her a slight nod, but before he could turn away, he saw the approach of Tyrion Lannister, newly freed from his chains. Tyrion offered a small bow to Oberyn and Ellaria. "Prince Oberyn, my lady Ellaria." His voice was subdued but colored by relief. "Thank you again for your intervention. I would be dead if not for your skill." "We have discussed that, imp," Oberyn said, though not unkindly. "But I understand the sentiment." Tyrion's mismatched eyes flicked around the hall. "May I offer you some hospitality? Perhaps a drink, though I fear my access to the cellars is uncertain. My father might well have them locked up to keep me from celebrating." He gave a short, bitter chuckle. Oberyn raised a brow. He was inclined to speak further with Tyrion, for if anyone in House Lannister might be an ally, or at least a neutral party, it could be the dwarf. Oberyn's victory had spared Tyrion's life, and Tyrion was no friend to Tywin. Perhaps it would be wise to keep the conversation going. "I would welcome a drink," Oberyn said. Ellaria nodded agreement. "We Dornish prefer a rich vintage, but I'll not be picky tonight." Tyrion nodded, some of the tension in his stance relaxing. He gestured for them to follow him toward one of the smaller chambers off the main hall. A quiet hush fell around them. The other courtiers gave them sidelong glances, uncertain what alliances might be forming. Oberyn did not spare them another look. Let them wonder. Once inside a smaller, more intimate chamber, richly appointed with tapestries of hunts and battles, a tall sideboard with decanters of wine, Tyrion dismissed the servants with a wave of his hand, offering privacy. Ilaria perched on a cushioned seat by the window. Oberyn took in the surroundings quickly, noting there were no obvious spies, though in King's Landing one could never be truly certain. Tyrion poured 3 cups of a deep red arbor wine. When he handed one to Oberyn, his words came out in a murmur. "Is the mountain truly dead?" Tyrion asked, as though he could scarcely believe it. "I saw the final blow, but that man has cheated death before." Oberyn nodded once, gravely. "If my spear did not kill him outright, my poisons would have finished him soon enough. He is gone." There was a note of finality in his voice that made Ilaria smile faintly. She reached for Oberyn's hand, linking their fingers. "Then I owe you my life," Tyrion said. "And that begs a question. What now?" Oberyn sipped the wine. It was sweet, though his taste buds still seemed to buzz with the memory of the copper tang of blood. "Now," he said quietly, "I return to Dorne eventually, but not before I ensure that justice does not end here. The mountain's death was a necessary step, but not the only one I seek." Tyrion studied him, brow furrowed. "Do you mean to accuse my father publicly? You know he denies all knowledge of Elia's fate." A brittle laugh escaped Oberyn's lips. "Do you believe him innocent?" he asked. "Your father is cunning. He has always placed the advantage of House Lannister above all else. And he unleashed the mountain on my sister and her children." His eyes narrowed. "He can deny it all he likes, but I know the truth." Tyrion sighed, looking away. "I cannot pretend to know all the details of that horrify. See time. But if you push too hard, Tywin will strike back, if not at you directly, then at those you hold dear. The man can be dangerously creative in his reprisal." Oberyn's jaw tightened. "I know. Dorne will not cower. The days of House Martell suffering in silence are over." In the flickering lamplight, Ilaria's face was set with quiet determination. "What good is vengeance if it brings more bloodshed upon our home, Oberyn?" she asked softly. "You have given Elia some measure of retribution by killing her killer. Must we risk a war?" "It may not be war exactly," Oberyn said, taking a deep breath, "but we must negotiate from a position of strength. The Lannisters now see that Dorne is not to be trifled with. That knowledge can give us power in negotiations. Dorne has always been separate. We joined the 7 kingdoms on our own terms. That independence remains the core of who we are." Tyrion raised his cup to his lips, then paused. "In any case, I imagine we will see interesting times. My father does not appreciate humiliations, especially not public ones. But for tonight, Prince Oberyn, my lady, I suggest we toast to your victory and to my continued life." Oberyn inclined his head in agreement, while Ilaria, still troubled, accepted the toast. They drank in silence. The wine tasted richer now, tinged with the knowledge of success and the looming threats. Oberyn realized that the next few days would be critical in determining how the rest of this game would play out. To be the victor on the battlefield or in the duel circle was only half the war. The other half was waged with whispers in corridors and bargains in dark rooms. King's Landing was a viper's nest as surely as any desert canyon in Dorne. A short while later, Oberyn and Ilaria took their leave. They walked back through the Red Keep's corridors, escorted by guards that Tywin had no doubt ordered to keep an eye on them. Oberyn's thoughts churned. Tomorrow or the day after, letters would fly to Doran Martell in Sunspear, telling the tale of his brother's triumph. Doran would consider the implications for trade, alliances, or even open conflict. Oberyn was no statesman like Doran, but he understood enough to know that a shift had occurred in the balance of power. With Gregor gone, Tywin's grip on fearsome intimidation had loosened. It might not break outright, but a crack was there. Ilaria's voice drew him from his thoughts. "Are you sure you are not wounded, my prince?" She pressed a hand against his arm, concern in her eyes. Oberyn touched her cheek lightly. "Only bruises, my love. Nothing that will not heal quickly." He paused, letting the warmth of her presence soothe him for a moment. "Come, we should rest. Tomorrow the games begin anew." They found their chambers, and the night passed in restless dreams for Oberyn, half expecting the mountain's giant hand to burst through the door. Yet when dawn broke, he awoke to the pale light in his room, safe and alive. The bed beside him was warm where Ilaria had slept, but she had risen early. He found her already dressed in a light Dornish gown by the window, where a breeze from Blackwater Bay stirred the curtains. A soft smile touched her lips when she saw him stir. "Good morning," she murmured. "There is word that the council meets this day. Will you attend?" He rose, stretching out the knots in his shoulders. "If I am invited, yes. If not, I'll appear uninvited. I have no intention of letting them make decisions behind my back." He dressed quickly in a simpler version of his Dornish attire. Supple leather breeches and a flowing tunic in deep orange, embroidered with snakes around the collar. He slid a thin-bladed dagger into his belt, never one to wander unarmed. Soon enough, a young messenger arrived. The lad bowed awkwardly. "Prince Oberyn, my Lord Hand requests your presence at the council meeting in the Tower of the Hand." Oberyn's eyebrows rose in faint surprise. He had not expected Tywin to extend an invitation so soon, but it confirmed that Tywin was making calculated moves. Perhaps he wanted Oberyn under his watchful eye. The messenger quickly departed, and Oberyn shared a look with Ilaria. "Shall we see what the old lion has planned?" She rested a hand on his shoulder. "Be careful, Oberyn. This is his den." He nodded grimly. "I know." They made their way through the Red Keep's labyrinthine corridors, flanked by more Lannister guards than usual, until they reached the Tower of the Hand. Inside a large, airy chamber, a rectangular table stood. Tywin Lannister was already seated at the head, his posture regal, robed in fine black and gold. Around him were figures that Oberyn recognized: Grand Maester Pycelle, Mace Tyrell, and Ser Kevan Lannister. One seat remained empty, presumably for Oberyn. Cersei was not present, nor was Prince Tommen. Only the core council seemed assembled. Tywin gestured for Oberyn to sit at the far end of the table. Oberyn obliged, ignoring any sense of intimidation in the old man's presence. Ilaria stayed behind him, as was customary for a companion not formally on the council, but she stood tall, unafraid. Oberyn offered a slight inclination of his head. "Lord Tywin, you summoned me?" Tywin's green eyes flicked to Oberyn's face, betraying no emotion. "The king's small council meets to discuss matters of the realm, including some that pertain to Dorne. It seems only proper that you attend." Grand Maester Pycelle cleared his throat. "Yes, indeed. The destruction caused by the war is still being tallied across the Crownlands and the Riverlands. We must consider what role each region might play in helping to restore order and pay the crown's debts." Oberyn gave a wry smile, well aware that the Lannisters, for all their gold, were heavily in debt. "I imagine House Lannister is mindful of the crown's debts," he said. Tywin's gaze was cool. "We are. And we are mindful of the benefits or disadvantages of each alliance we hold. Dorne, for instance, has not been ravaged by the War of the Five Kings, keeping its army intact. That is a considerable advantage. We had hoped to solidify that advantage through a marriage alliance between Myrcella Baratheon and Prince Trystane, but matters have grown complicated." Mace Tyrell cleared his throat, shifting on his seat. "Complicated indeed. We must maintain the peace. The Tyrells, as the major supporters of the crown, would prefer no hostilities with Dorne. And yet, the slaying of Ser Gregor is a notable event." Oberyn raised a brow. Ser Gregor stood as Tyrion's accuser in a trial by combat. He lost. "I do not see the complication in that." Tywin's mouth tightened. "Gregor Clegane was a bannerman of House Lannister, a sworn sword. You might not realize how it looks for Dorne to arrive in King's Landing, kill one of our mightiest knights, and then claim it was all above board. Certain conclusions could be drawn." Oberyn felt a flicker of anger, but he kept his composure. "Conclusions that a fair trial by combat was indeed fair? Even a child can see the logic, my lord. If your sworn sword failed, that is hardly my fault." Grand Maester Pycelle tried to interject diplomatically. "We must not let the realm fall back into chaos over a single duel. The people are weary of war. Tywin tapped his fingers on the table, eyes remaining on Oberyn. So you say, I know you came to King's Landing seeking justice for your sister. You believe it found with Clegane's death. Oberyn's voice was steadier than he felt. I believe the man who raped and murdered Elia Martell has paid for his crimes. But what of the man who gave him the order? A hush settled over the table. Mace Tyrell's eyes darted between Oberyn and Tywin. Ser Kevin shifted uncomfortably. Pycelle coughed, his face reddening. Only Tywin's expression remained immovable, carved from stone. After a moment, Tywin spoke in an even tone. House Lannister denies any wrongdoing in the deaths of Princess Elia and her children. That matter was adjudicated years ago, and it was determined that the blame lay with Ser Gregor Clegane and others who acted without my knowledge. Oberyn refused to avert his gaze. And I do not accept that. But for now, the Mountain's death will suffice. Let Dorne and the Iron Throne proceed carefully. We have many shared concerns, do we not? Myrcella remains betrothed to Prince Trystane. The impetus for peace stands. Mace Tyrell seized on that. Yes, the betrothal remains, does it not? No sense in dissolving such a beneficial match. A measure of goodwill on both sides is best for the realm. Tywin let the silence drag. Oberyn realized that the old lion was gauging the cost of forging ahead with Myrcella's match versus severing ties with Dorne. But Oberyn suspected Tywin would not risk open conflict with Dorne, not when the Lannisters were still threatened by other powers and weighed down by debt. Ultimately, Tywin gave a single nod. The crown has no intention of dissolving the betrothal. As long as Dorne abides by the king's peace, there will be no further unpleasantness. Oberyn gave him a thin smile. Then we have an understanding. I imagine that is what you intended to convey. Tywin did not return the smile. Indeed, that is the main order of business regarding Dorne. The council will proceed with other matters. You may remain if you wish, or withdraw. The cool dismissal was clear. Oberyn rose, and Illyria followed. He offered a slight bow of his head, which Tywin did not deign to acknowledge. Then, without another word, Oberyn left the chamber, tension humming in his veins. He felt like an intruder in a pit of lions, but he refused to cower. Let them see he was unafraid. Let them wonder what else the Red Viper might do. Outside, in the corridor, Illyria slipped her arm through his. He wants to keep us close so he can watch us. Yes, and to remind me who holds power here, Oberyn said. But King's Landing is a place of illusions. He can hold the reins of the city, but beyond the Dornish marches, our prince brother rules. Tywin cannot easily strike us in our homeland, and he knows it. Still, Oberyn could not shake the feeling that Tywin had not finished with him yet. The tension in the air was thick, and the aftermath of the Mountain's death had only just begun to reverberate through the capital. He would need to remain vigilant. That afternoon, Oberyn took to the streets of King's Landing for a time, accompanied by a few Dornish bodyguards who had traveled with him. The sun was warm on the dusty roads, and the common folk gawked at the Red Viper when they recognized him. News of the duel had spread like wildfire, and some called out praise. "Well done, my lord!" Others only stared in awe or fear, uncertain of what changes might come. Oberyn watched the lines of ragged men and women, children with hollow eyes. War had brought famine, disease, and sorrow. A part of him felt empathy, though he had come to King's Landing on a mission of vengeance. Still, he was not blind to suffering. At a small tavern in Flea Bottom, Oberyn bought drinks for a few battered sellswords who recognized him, gleaning bits of information about the city's mood. He heard that many believed Tywin was weakened by losing his champion. The small folk took it as a sign that the Lannisters were not invincible, that change might be in the air. Some even whispered that the Targaryen girl across the sea would land in Westeros soon, taking advantage of any cracks in Lannister rule. Oberyn stored those rumors away, mindful that Doran had always shown some interest in the Targaryen cause. By the time dusk approached, Oberyn returned to the Red Keep. There, he found a note delivered to his chambers, bearing Tyrion Lannister's distinctive handwriting. He opened it and read, "Prince Oberyn, I invite you to dine with me and my brother, Jaime, this evening. I believe we have matters to discuss that could be of mutual interest." Tyrion. Oberyn considered it. He had no love for the Lannister family as a whole, but Tyrion was distinct from the rest. Jaime Lannister was a more uncertain quantity. The Kingslayer was rumored to be changed since his captivity and the loss of his sword hand. Curiosity tugged at Oberyn. He decided to accept. Perhaps an alliance could form, or at least a truce with the more reasonable members of the Lannister clan. When Oberyn and Ellaria arrived at the appointed dining room, they found Jaime and Tyrion seated at a small table set with wine, roasted duck, fresh bread, and a spread of cheeses and fruits. Jaime stood, offering a short, awkward bow. Tyrion grinned, though his eyes remained watchful. "My prince, my lady, thank you for joining us." Ellaria took a seat gracefully. Oberyn dipped his head. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Twice in one day, Lord Tyrion." Tyrion poured wine into goblets. "I find that we share certain priorities, or at least certain enemies." His gaze flicked to Jaime, who nodded in quiet agreement. "Such as your father?" Oberyn asked bluntly. He was not one for subtlety when it came to such matters. Tyrion let out a sardonic chuckle. "Let's say that Lord Tywin and I do not always see eye to eye. He still resents that I was proven innocent, and in a manner that shamed him. And you, Prince Oberyn, have your own reasons for distrusting him." Jaime's voice was quieter than Oberyn remembered. "Tyrion tells me that you do not believe our father's claims of innocence regarding Elia. You likely have good reasons." He swallowed, meeting Oberyn's gaze. "I cannot speak to everything that happened during the sack of King's Landing. I was in the Kingsguard at the time in the Red Keep, ensuring Aerys did not burn the city to ashes. But I do know that father orchestrated certain actions that he considered necessary to prove loyalty to Robert Baratheon." Oberyn's hand clenched around his goblet. "Are you confessing? Or are you simply telling me nothing I don't already know?" Jaime shook his head, frustration evident. "I'm telling you that I cannot confirm the details of who gave the order to kill Elia or her children. I was not privy to that. But I am certain father intended the elimination of the Targaryen heirs as a gift to the new king. Gregor Clegane was the means. That is the likely truth." Tyrion gave Jaime a sidelong look, as if impressed that his brother spoke so plainly. "Our father is pragmatic," Tyrion said. "Too pragmatic to consider the moral horror of such an act." Oberyn breathed deeply, his anger roiling beneath the surface. "You tell me this now. Why?" He locked eyes with Tyrion, then Jaime. "To soothe your conscience? Or to imply that you might stand with me if I move against Lord Tywin?" Jaime's lips thinned. "Stand with you against my father? That is a step I am not ready to take. But I would not let him kill you if I can prevent it. I owe Tyrion. You saved him from a grave injustice." Tyrion nodded. "We share a father who rules with an iron fist. We both have reason to be wary of him. My father thrives on fear, on controlling every piece on the board. Yet you've upset that balance, Prince Oberyn. I only suggest that we keep channels open." Oberyn allowed a small, humorless laugh. "Am I to believe you might sabotage your father's plans on my behalf? Because you owe me for saving Tyrion's life? I am not so naive, Lannisters, but if you wish for civility, I can grant that. If I see an advantage in working with you, so be it." Ellaria spoke up then, her voice calm but firm. "Vengeance for Elia is only partially served with the mountain's death. My prince does not forget that Lord Tywin was behind it all. But we also must think of Dorne's safety." Tyrion nodded. "Yes, our father is not invincible, and he is aging. The war took a toll on House Lannister. The gold mines no longer produce as they once did. We have debts to the Iron Bank, to the Tyrells. That sort of vulnerability invites foes. You could join that list, or perhaps you could exercise patience and watch as other forces weaken him. I only suggest you not throw away your life in a direct confrontation." Oberyn listened carefully. Tyrion was offering a puzzle piece. the knowledge that House Lannister stood on a precarious financial footing. The debts, the emptiness of the mines, coupled with the loss of Gregor, House Lannister's deterrent factor was diminished. This was valuable intelligence. Perhaps Oberyn could leverage it on behalf of Dorne. He nodded once. Very well, I will keep this in mind. For now, we maintain the peace, if only in name. They ate and drank, the conversation drifting to less dire topics. Jaime seemed more subdued, occasionally sipping wine and glancing at his golden hand, a replacement for the one he lost. Tyrion told a few sardonic jokes about the court. Illyria politely listened, contributing a remark now and again. Oberyn, for his part, weighed every word, every look. Despite the surface cordiality, a coil of tension remained. One misstep, and the old lion would bare his claws. For the moment, however, the Red Viper was content to watch and wait. A few days passed in a haze of court ceremonies, feast invitations, and subtle power plays. The entire city buzzed with the gossip that Oberyn Martell had slain the Mountain. Some toasted him as a hero who had avenged old atrocities. Others condemned him as a snake who had undone one of the realm's strongest knights. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister maintained a facade of calm governance, as though Gregor's death were a minor inconvenience. The wheels of state turned, but Oberyn sensed a shift. Lords who had once fawned over Tywin's might now approach the Dornish prince with cautious respect. During these days, Oberyn attended a feast in the Great Hall. King Tommen sat on the throne, bored by the endless parade of courtiers, while Margaery Tyrell played the gracious queen-to-be at his side, smiling and speaking softly. Cersei hovered nearby, with her gaze sliding toward Oberyn every so often, her expression unreadable. Somewhere in the crowd, Tyrion drank heavily, his posture telling of a man who felt out of place. Jaime stood with the Kingsguard, one gold hand resting on the hilt of his sword, though it was all for show now. Varys drifted among the courtiers like a spider weaving his web of whispers. At one point, the Master of Whisperers drifted to Oberyn's side. "Prince Oberyn," Varys said with that soft, unctuous tone of his. "Might we have a word in private?" Oberyn eyed him. "If you insist." They stepped out to a quieter alcove, lit by torches and a single flickering candle in a wall sconce. Varys folded his hands together. "I wish to congratulate you, belatedly, on your victory. The Mountain was a terror to many." Oberyn studied the eunuch's plump face. "And yet you keep your own counsel, Lord Varys. What do you want?" Varys offered a mild smile. "I serve the realm, Prince Oberyn. That is all I've ever claimed. The realm, in its current state, is fragile. You have disturbed the balance by striking down Tywin's champion. I wonder if you have further plans that might shake the realm even more. Would you warn me off? Or encourage me?" Oberyn asked. "Warn you, perhaps. Tywin Lannister is ruthless. He will not act precipitously, but when he does, it will be decisive. If you remain in King's Landing, you place yourself at risk. Yet if you depart, you concede the field. I only advise caution." Varys paused, tilting his head. "And, if I might suggest, the realm could benefit from a more measured approach. We have many enemies outside our borders. Stannis Baratheon remains at large, the Ironborn raid the coast, and rumors of dragons across the narrow sea multiply. Internal conflicts only weaken us. I would not see Dorne brought in to open war against the Iron Throne." Oberyn felt a ripple of annoyance. Everyone counseled caution. "Thank you for your advice, Lord Varys. I will weigh it carefully." Varys's smile never faltered. "I am pleased to hear it. I remain at your disposal should you require information. Good evening, my prince." With that, he drifted away like a ghost, disappearing into the crowd. Oberyn watched him go. Everyone had an angle in King's Landing. He returned to Illyria, who waited by a column. "What did he want?" she asked softly. "To plant seeds of caution, or to glean some sign of my intentions." Oberyn pressed a hand lightly to the small of her back. "Let us leave this feast. I have had enough of Lannister hospitality for the night." They departed, ignoring the curious glances that followed them. The halls outside the great hall felt oddly empty, every footstep echoing off the stone. Night had fallen, and torches illuminated the tapestries. The flickering light seemed to make the lions dance and grimace on the cloth. Oberyn forced himself to relax. He needed rest, and soon he would need to decide whether to remain in King's Landing or return to Dorne. He had accomplished the primary goal, Gregor's death. But the larger matter of Tywin's guilt still seethed. Would Doran prefer a diplomatic approach? Almost certainly. But would Oberyn be content to leave having done only half the job? Back in his chambers, Oberyn found a sealed scroll bearing the sigil of House Martell. He broke the wax, reading Doran's message. "Brother, word of your success has reached us. The people of Dorne rejoice. Yet I counsel restraint. Tywin Lannister remains Hand of the King and wields great influence. Myrcella Baratheon is still to be betrothed to Trystane, and that union may bring us long-sought leverage in the affairs of the realm. A rash move now could jeopardize all we have worked for. Return to Sunspear when you are able so we may discuss our strategy in full. Be safe, Oberyn. We have lost too many loved ones already. Doran." Oberyn exhaled, letting the scroll roll closed. Doran was always the careful one. He played a long game, weaving alliances and plots behind the scenes. Elaya's murder had scarred him, but unlike Oberyn, Doran expressed his fury through quiet, methodical planning. Oberyn respected his brother's intellect, though he chafed at the slowness of that approach. Still, perhaps Doran was right. Perhaps the time to push openly against Tywin was not yet. The Mountain's death was a victory, and many in Dorne would see it as a symbol that House Martell was not helpless. Ellaria came to read the message over his shoulder. When she finished, she placed a gentle hand on Oberyn's back. "Doran is wise. We should return home, Oberyn." He sighed. "I know, but we must ensure Myrcella's betrothal remains secure, and that Tywin does not seek immediate revenge. We'll depart soon, though. King's Landing is not a place I wish to linger, even in victory." The next morning, Oberyn made arrangements to prepare for departure, quietly sending word to the Dornish retinue who had accompanied him. Over the course of a few days, he tied up what few commitments he had in the city, parted ways with Tyrion, who offered a last expression of gratitude, and even exchanged tense farewells with Cersei, who made no secret of her loathing. On the day Oberyn planned to leave, he was summoned one final time to meet Tywin in the solar adjacent to the Hand's private chambers. Oberyn almost refused, but curiosity got the better of him. Ellaria accompanied him. They found Tywin seated behind a heavy wooden desk, a single Lannister guard posted at the door. Light streamed in through tall windows, illuminating Tywin's stern face. "So," Tywin said, his voice echoing in the quiet chamber, "you depart at last, Prince Oberyn." Oberyn inclined his head. "Dorne calls me home, Lord Tywin. My business here is done." Tywin's gaze raked over him. "Is it? I wonder. You arrived seeking the death of Gregor Clegane, and you achieved it. Perhaps that is satisfaction enough. But let me give you one final warning. Do not act rashly in the future. Dorne is part of the Seven Kingdoms. We will not tolerate rebellion." Oberyn's lips curled in a faint sneer. "We Dornish are not so easily cowed, nor do we threaten rebellion lightly, but we expect to be treated with respect, especially after what happened to Elia." Tywin's eyes flared briefly, like a lion's final snarl. "Elia Martell was a tragedy of war, Prince Oberyn. Nothing more, nothing less." Heat flared in Oberyn's chest, but he forced himself to remain composed. "It was murder, Lord Tywin. Don't pretend otherwise. And murder does not go unpunished forever." Tywin rose slowly, palms pressing on the desk. "You have had your revenge on the mountain. That is all you will ever have." The words were spoken with a quiet finality that hung in the air. Oberyn met his glare, letting the tension sharpen. "For now," was all he said. Then he turned, Ellaria's arm locked with his, and walked out. Behind him, Tywin did not speak again. Perhaps the old lion could sense that no more words would break or bend the Red Viper's resolve. Outside the solar, The corridor felt stifling, as though the walls themselves were steeped in centuries of Lannister arrogance. Oberyn quickened his steps, leading Ellaria away. Soon enough, they stepped out into the courtyard where their horses and retinue waited. Tyrion stood among them, accompanied by Podrick Payne. "You're truly leaving, then?" Tyrion said, a twist of regret in his voice. "It was interesting having you here, Prince Oberyn." Oberyn allowed a small smile. "Interesting is one word for it. I wish you luck, Tyrion Lannister. You'll need it, I think." Tyrion sighed, glancing at the red keep looming overhead. No doubt I will. Farewell." They clasped hands briefly. Jaime was not present, nor was Cersei, or even Varys. Oberyn supposed they were content to see him go. He vaulted onto his horse, Ellaria mounting her own. Their small band of Dornish guards, resplendent in light armor and silken mantles, closed ranks around them. With a final nod to Tyrion, Oberyn spurred his horse and rode from the Red Keep, passing under the portcullis onto the city streets. The small folk watched, some with curiosity, some with applause, as the Prince of Dorne made his exit. Crossing King's Gate, they left King's Landing behind. The group made their way down the King's Road, the city shrinking in the distance as days passed. Though the road was dusty and the journey long, Oberyn felt a strange sense of relief each morning as the distance grew between him and the capital. Occasionally, they passed columns of soldiers or small bands of travelers who recognized Oberyn and murmured about the duel. He paid them little mind, focusing on the road ahead, on the red mountains that would eventually appear on the horizon, marking the border of Dorne. During the journey, Oberyn couldn't help but consider the repercussions of his victory. The mountain was gone. No more would that hulking brute terrorize the Riverlands or protect Lannister interests with cruelty. That alone might save countless lives. And it proved a symbolic blow against Tywin's fearsome reputation. Yet Oberyn also knew Tywin would not forgive or forget. This might be the beginning of a subtle conflict. Perhaps the Lannisters would try to sabotage Dornish trade routes or undermine the marriage alliance. Doran would be prepared for such eventualities, but Oberyn vowed that he would remain vigilant. Nightly, around campfires beneath the stars, Oberyn and Ellaria would speak softly of what the future might hold. Ellaria's concerns centered on protecting their daughters, the Sand Snakes. She wanted them to have a secure future, not one overshadowed by war with the Lannisters. Oberyn reassured her that he would do all he could to shield them. Yet in his heart, he wondered if the cycle of vengeance ever truly ended, or if the sins of the past would continue to shape the next generation. For centuries, Dorne had fought to maintain its independence. The Martells had pride in that legacy, and they had also lost so much to the Targaryens, then to the Baratheons and Lannisters. Would it ever stop? When at last they reached the Prince's Pass and beheld the rugged beauty of Dornish terrain, Oberyn felt his spirits lift. The sun was hotter here, the air drier. His body seemed to welcome it like a long-lost friend. The mountains loomed overhead, jagged peaks that made for harsh travel but comforting privacy. They passed through villages where the people welcomed Oberyn with cheers once they recognized him. News had spread faster than their horses could ride, and everyone knew the Red Viper had avenged Elia. Women threw flowers in his path. Children ran along beside the horses, calling out his name. He smiled at them, raising a hand in greeting. At night, they found shelter in holdfasts or inns that treated them as honored guests. Finally, they arrived at Sunspear, capital of Dorne. A sprawling fortress, the walls and towers sculpted from pale stone, greeted them against the backdrop of the sea. The heat seemed to shimmer in the air. The smell of salt water and spices enveloped them. Oberyn felt his heart swell with familiarity, with a sense of coming home. The gates opened wide, and Dornish banners fluttered overhead, the spear and sun emblazoned in red and gold. Doran Martell awaited them in the grand courtyard. He sat in a wheeled chair, as his gout often made walking difficult. Around him stood a small gathering of attendants, guards, and a few familiar faces. Doran's wife, Malario, was conspicuously absent, as she had long ago returned to her homeland, but Oberyn's daughters stood near the front, bright-eyed. Elia Sand ran forward to embrace her father, with Obella, Doria, and Larisa behind her. Even the older sand snakes, Obara, Nymeria, and Tyene, hovered in the background, each with her own expression of pride or curiosity. Oberyn dismounted, hugging his children warmly. Ilaria did the same, tears in her eyes to see them all together again. Then Oberyn moved to Doran's side. The older man extended his hand, and Oberyn clasped it. Doran's face was etched with years of pain and quiet contemplation. "Brother," Doran said softly, "welcome home." Oberyn nodded. "It's good to be home." He held Doran's gaze, searching for approval, or anger, or relief. He found a mixture of emotions swirling in his brother's dark eyes. "You have done what you set out to do," Doran said. "Though it was not the path I would have chosen, still the people are heartened. The Lannisters cannot so lightly dismiss Dorne anymore." Oberyn exhaled. "That was my hope, but Tywin will be stewing in his rancor. He will scheme. We must be prepared." Doran's hand tightened around Oberyn's. "We will be. Come inside, rest, and let us speak of what happens next." He gestured for Oberyn to follow. They entered the cool interior of Sunspear, leaving the glare of the sun behind. In a private chamber, Doran and Oberyn sat while Ilaria and the sand snakes lingered just outside, giving the brothers space. Servants brought chilled wine and bowls of fruit. Oberyn sank onto a cushioned seat, feeling the weariness of his travels. Doran studied him with a penetrating look. "Tell me everything," Doran said. "The duel, the aftermath, Tywin's reaction. Omit no detail." And Oberyn did just that, recounting how he had landed the final blow on the mountain, how the crowd had erupted, how Tywin had declared Tyrion innocent, and how the next days of tense negotiation unfolded. Doran listened closely, occasionally nodding or pursing his lips. When Oberyn finished, Doran was quiet for a long moment. "You have turned the realm's eyes upon Dorne," he said at length. "Some in admiration, others in fear. The question is how best to capitalize on that." Oberyn drank from his goblet, letting the tartness of the Dornish wine roll over his tongue. "We are not interested in open war, are we, brother? You've always counseled caution, especially while the Iron Throne is strong." Doran inclined his head. "The throne is weaker than it was, but not weak enough to confront directly. We are forging connections. Myrcella is still betrothed to Trystane, which could grant us legitimate ties to the Iron Throne. Ties we can use to influence matters from within. If King Tommen one day falls from grace, or if another claimant arises, we might find opportunity. I have not forgotten Elia's children were Targaryens, nor have I forgotten Daenerys Targaryen across the sea, rumored to have dragons." The mention of dragons sparked Oberyn's curiosity. He had heard the rumors, but had given them little credence. "You think the Targaryen girl might truly land in Westeros one day?" Doran's expression was guarded. "If she does, she may seek alliances, especially with those who hold grudges against the Lannisters. Dorne has reason to side with her, but that is not a decision to make lightly. We need more information. For now, let the Lannisters reel from your victory. Let them nurse their wounds. And in the meantime, we strengthen ourselves here." Oberyn nodded slowly. "So it seems we wait again." Doran offered a slight, sad smile. "That is the Martell way, is it not? Unbent, unbowed, unbroken. We do not simply lash out in fury. We plan, we persevere. And one day, justice comes." Oberyn's mind drifted to the moment he killed Gregor, the spear-piercing flesh, the surge of triumph. It had felt like justice, but also like just one small step in a larger journey. Perhaps that was what Doran meant. The wheels of fate turned slowly, and Dorne's vengeance might require more patience yet. They spoke for a while longer of politics, of the state of the realm, of the Tyrell influence in King's Landing, of alliances that might be formed or broken. When at last Oberyn emerged into the corridor, his daughters rushed forward with questions about the duel, about King's Landing. The older sand snakes especially had that fierce glint in their eyes, Obara demanded all the gory details of how the mountain fell. Tyene asked about the poisons Oberyn used, and Nymeria wanted to hear about the crowd's reaction. Illyria gently tried to keep them calm, though she too smiled with pride. In the days that followed, Oberyn found himself slipping back into a more comfortable routine, training with the spear in the warm Dornish sun, riding out to see old friends in the water gardens, indulging in the pleasures that Dorne offered. Yet at night, he would dream of the mountain's monstrous visage, or of Tywin Lannister's cold glare, or of the faint lines of sorrow on Tyrion's face. The game was not over. He had merely moved his piece to a different part of the board. Every day, ravens arrived from King's Landing, from Highgarden, from across the sea. Whispers of new rumors floated through Sunspear. Stannis Baratheon gathering strength in the north, the Ironborn launching raids, Daenerys Targaryen freeing slaves in Meereen. The realm churned with upheaval, and House Martell stood poised, waiting for the next wave that might crash against the shores of Dorne. At times, Oberyn would discuss these events with Doran late into the evening, sipping spiced wine in the torchlit halls of Sunspear. "I do not regret killing Gregor," Oberyn said one evening as they strolled along a shaded walkway overlooking the sea. "But I wonder if I was too swift. A part of me wanted him to confess, to name Tywin as the one who gave the order. Now that chance is gone." Doran watched the last rays of sunlight glint on the water. Confession would have made the realm question Tywin's authority openly, but he would have found a way to suppress it. "No, brother, your action was the correct one. The people of Dorne are satisfied that the brute who killed Elia is dead. That is enough to unify us behind our next steps." Oberyn exhaled, letting the sea breeze ruffle his hair. "Let us hope so." His gaze went distant. "Perhaps next time, the blow will land on Tywin himself." Doran's lips parted in a faint smile, though a hint of warning lurked in his expression. "We shall see. Patience, Oberyn. Let him crumble under the weight of his own schemes." Such was the shape of Oberyn's life for some months. He remained in Dorne, coordinating with Doran, forging new friendships among the Dornish lords who admired his victory. Life seemed to settle, though the undercurrent of tension never vanished. Letters arrived from King's Landing, some carrying polite inquiries about Myrcella's upcoming travel to Dorne, others quietly inquiring about trade. Tywin was extending a cautious olive branch, or perhaps a hidden dagger. Oberyn penned replies in consultation with Doran, ensuring that any negotiations served Dornish interests first. Gradually, Oberyn came to realize that by swiftly killing the mountain, he had indeed changed the course of the realm's politics. Without Gregor, Tywin had lost one of his greatest tools of terror. The Lannisters had to tread more carefully. The illusions of their invulnerability cracked. Among the small folk and even some lesser lords, rumors spread that the Lannisters were not as mighty as they proclaimed, that the Red Viper had drawn blood from the lion. It emboldened some of Tywin's enemies. Stannis in the north, petty lords who had grudges, or schemers like Littlefinger who always thrived on chaos. Subtly, the chessboard had shifted. Yet as the days turned into weeks, weeks into months, Oberyn found that life in Sunspear was surprisingly peaceful, almost too peaceful. He wondered if Tywin bided his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. But no retribution came, no plot to assassinate Oberyn materialized. Perhaps Tywin recognized that any assault on Oberyn would unify Dorne in vengeance. For all his hatred, Tywin Lannister was a practical man. He would not risk a full-blown war. Meanwhile, the realm had larger fires to contain, rumors of wildlings in the far north, tensions with the Tyrells over certain crown debts, and the uncertain threat of Daenerys Targaryen across the sea. Then, one bright morning, a raven arrived bearing the royal seal. It requested that Myrcella Baratheon be sent to Dorne to begin her formal betrothal to Trystane Martell. Doran took the letter to Oberyn. "Tywin moves forward with the match. He must truly wish to keep us appeased," Doran said, handing the parchment to his brother. Oberyn scanned it. The flowery words were typical of royal court scribes, but the meaning was clear. They were offering Myrcella as a ward to House Martell, a sign of trust, or an attempt to keep Dorne in line. "Do we accept?" Doran nodded. "It's part of the agreement. We gain a royal hostage of sorts, which gives us leverage. Tywin must feel confident we won't harm her. But he also knows that if he provokes us, Myrcella is in our hands. A small, satisfied smile curved Oberyn's lips. Good. Let her see how Dorne lives. Perhaps she'll prefer our sun and warmth to that nest of vipers in King's Landing. And if Tywin breaks faith, we'll have a suitable response. Doran slowly wheeled his chair toward a window. Precisely. This is the shape of our revenge, Oberyn. Not in one fell swoop, but in small steps. Each move positioning us for the future. The letter seemed to confirm that Tywin's approach would be subtle cooperation rather than open hostility. Oberyn set the parchment aside, memories of King's Landing flashing through his mind. The shimmering spear point piercing Gregor's throat, the hush of the crowd, the final sputter of the mountain's breath. Perhaps, in the end, that moment was enough to tip the scales. Perhaps it had convinced Tywin to see Dorne not as a province to be dominated, but as a power that must be placated. If so, it was a victory that Oberyn Martell would cherish. He stood by the window, gazing out at the pale walls of Sunspear, the shining sea beyond, the fluttering banners with the sun and spear sigil. Alya's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him of her laughter, her gentleness, the way she had always loved the warmth of Dorne. He whispered softly to the wind, "I avenged you, sister. May it bring you peace." Below in the courtyard, the sand snakes sparred, their laughter and fierce cries blending in the sunlit air. Alleria watched them, arms folded, a fond smile on her face. Life moved on, and Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper, found a measure of solace in that knowledge. He had struck a blow for Elia. He had ensured his own survival. And while the Lannisters still held the Iron Throne, they had been reminded that Dorne did not forget and did not forgive easily. Weeks later, Myrcella Baratheon arrived in Sunspear, escorted by a modest retinue of Lannister guards and accompanied by Ser Aerys Oakheart of the Kingsguard. The young princess blinked in awe at the Dornish sun, the desert flowers, the colorful silks. Doran greeted her courteously, presenting Trystane, who bowed shyly. The betrothal ceremony was a small but official affair, with Oberyn standing behind Doran, arms folded, gaze keen. Myrcella seemed kind, if a bit nervous. Oberyn observed her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Another child caught in the great game of Westeros. But perhaps, under Dornish guidance, she could learn a different way of living than the cruelty so common in King's Landing. In the months that followed, Myrcella settled into Dornish life surprisingly well, forging a genuine friendship with Trystane. Oberyn would see them in the gardens, laughing over a game of Cyvasse. The presence of a royal princess in Sunspear lent an air of importance and further stabilized the relationship with the crown, for the time being. Oberyn knew Tywin had not forgotten or forgiven, but as Doran often said, timing was everything. The old lion would one day make a move, or else his children might after his passing. If that day came, Dorne would be ready. And so the realm shifted, with Oberyn Martell's swift victory over the mountain rippling out into the broader tapestry of Westeros. The Lannisters had been forced into caution, Tyrion's life had been spared, and a fragile peace took hold between Dorne and the Iron Throne. Over time, the memory of the trial by combat in King's Landing would become legend. How the Red Viper danced around the mountain's brutal blows, taunting him to confess, then struck with deadly grace, ending the giant's reign of terror in a single stroke. Yet Oberyn himself knew the deeper truth. This was not the end of a story, but the beginning of another chapter. The seeds of vengeance, of ambition, of justice, had been sown in blood, and the harvest would be reaped in the days to come. For all that Oberyn had gained, and all that Tywin had lost, the political storm still gathered. Perhaps in time, the Targaryen dragons would fly across the sea, or the North would rise again, or the Iron Bank would call in the Lannister debts, fracturing their hold on the realm. When that day arrived, Oberyn Martell intended to be ready, spear in hand, leading Dorne to claim the full measure of justice that had been so long denied. For now, though Oberyn found contentment where he could, in the laughter of his daughters, in Alleria's embrace, in the knowledge that Elia was avenged. Sometimes, during warm Dornish nights, He would climb to the highest tower of Sunspear and look northward, imagining Tywin brooding in the Red Keep. Perhaps the old lion sat, plotting, but never quite daring to let slip the dogs of war against Dorne. That was victory enough, for a time. And so the Red Viper stayed his hand, but he did not sheathe his spear entirely. Dorne waited, coiled, and watchful. The years would unveil new dangers and new opportunities. Yet the day the mountain fell would forever stand as a testament to House Martell's strength. Oberyn had struck first and lived to tell the tale, proving that in the deadly Game of Thrones, sometimes the swiftest strike could topple even the greatest giant, if delivered with cunning, skill, and unyielding fury. Elia Martell's name would echo in that triumphant blow, and her memory would guide Oberyn and the whole of Dorne toward whatever future the Seven Kingdoms might face. Indeed, though the Lannisters remained powerful, a chill of uncertainty threaded through their legacy. So long as Oberyn Martell breathed, so long as Dorne remained unbowed and unbroken, the lion's roar no longer rang out quite so confidently across the land. And in the hush that followed that roar, the whisper of a viper's hiss promised that the taste of vengeance was sweet and never truly forgotten. Oberyn Martell's life in Sunspear eased into a steady rhythm in the months after Myrcella Baratheon's arrival. Yet beneath that tranquil surface, he sensed currents of change rippling across Westeros. The mountain's death was no small thing. It was the removal of a terrible piece from the board of power, and Oberyn had delivered that blow himself. Though months had passed since his return to Dorne, whispers of his triumph still echoed through the Seven Kingdoms. They called him the man who had crippled House Lannister's aura of invincibility. Some hailed him as a hero, some cursed him for daring to challenge the greatest power in the realm, but none could deny that the Red Viper had become a figure of legend. Now, Oberyn often walked the warm halls of Sunspear, accompanied by the scents of citrus and the salt-laced breezes off the summer sea. A familiar dryness hung in the Dornish air, so different from King's Landing's muggy odors, and he breathed it in as though it were a tonic. He visited the training yards and sparred with his daughters, the sand snakes, teaching them the subtle arts of speed, agility, and cunning. Sometimes he would break away from the training to watch Myrcella Baratheon and Trystane Martell strolling through the castle's fragrant gardens. There, Myrcella's honey-blonde hair caught the sunlight, while Trystane, still youthful but earnest, tried to charm her with little gifts or amusements. Myrcella seemed genuinely taken with Dorne. She loved the warmth, the exotic foods, and the freedom to move about with fewer prying eyes than in King's Landing. Whenever Oberyn saw the princess laugh, he felt a faint stirring of pity for her. She was a sweet girl, and though she carried Lannister blood, she was different from the lion's brood that had wrought so much pain upon House Martell. Oberyn remembered her mother, Cersei, always so quick to sneer at outsiders, so capable of bitter cruelty. But Myrcella seemed mild in comparison. She was a child cast into a dangerous game, a piece Tywin Lannister had moved on the board to appease Dorne. Oberyn could not forget that fact, yet he also could not help liking the girl for her gentle heart. Whenever Myrcella strolled with Trystane by the shaded arcade, Oberyn would watch from afar, leaning against a column, arms folded across his chest. Illyria might come to stand beside him, slipping her hand around his. "They look well together," she would remark softly, looking upon the young pair. "She's grown fond of him, as fond as two children can be," Oberyn would say, tempering the warm sentiment with realism. "They are what, 13? 14? They still see love as a pleasant dream. But soon they'll learn the weight of politics behind their match." Illyria sighed. "I hope that weight won't crush them, or turn them into the kind of monsters we've seen too often in King's Landing." He squeezed Illyria's hand gently. "We'll do what we can to keep them safe. And if the day comes that the Iron Throne tries to use Myrcella as a tool against us, well, we have our own means of response." Illyria nodded, her eyes dark with understanding. Both of them knew that Myrcella's presence was an unspoken hostage situation, a piece of leverage Dorne could use if Tywin Lannister or his heirs ever broke faith or threatened to harm House Martell. A grim reality, yet for now the girl was treated kindly, even doted upon. In those days of peace, Oberyn found himself grappling with a strange mix of satisfaction and restlessness. The mountain was gone, and with him much of the old hatred that had coiled in Oberyn's gut had found an outlet. He had tasted the sweetness of vengeance, and it had not destroyed him. He lived on, stronger than before, with the admiration of many Dornishmen who saw his deed as a triumph over Lannister cruelty. Yet Oberyn still felt as if the fullness of justice had not been done. Tywin Lannister remained unpunished for Elaya's murder. He remained Hand of the King, the most powerful figure in the realm, plotting and maneuvering to maintain Lannister dominance. That knowledge made Oberyn's blood simmer whenever he thought of it. On a late afternoon not long after Myrcella's arrival, Oberyn was sparring with Tyene Sand in a marble courtyard behind Sunspear's main tower. Palm trees and potted orange blossoms fringed the open space, their leaves rustling in the breeze. Tyene, a delicate-looking young woman with golden hair and a sweet smile, handled her twin daggers with lethal precision. She feinted left, then slashed right, aiming for Oberyn's ribs. Oberyn deflected easily with his spear, a smooth circular motion that sent her off balance. Yet Tyene recovered nimbly, stepping back and eyeing her father with cool intent. Sweat beaded on her brow, but her expression was serene. "You're improving," Oberyn said, circling lightly on the balls of his feet, "though you still telegraph your thrust with a subtle shift of your back foot. Keep it hidden." Tyene nodded, dashing forward again. Their weapons clacked, and Oberyn twisted, hooking the shaft of his spear around her right wrist. He applied minimal pressure to disarm her without harming her, and the dagger clattered to the ground. Then, with a final push, he sent Tyene stumbling. She came to a stop, breathing hard. "That's enough," he told her gently. He extended a hand to help her up, then gave her a faint smirk. "Never forget, speed is your friend. Speed and the element of surprise." She sheathed her remaining dagger, retrieving the fallen one. "Understood, father." A moment later, she added, "I hear that Uncle Doran has asked for you in the Solar. Another letter from King's Landing has arrived." Oberyn felt a surge of curiosity. "Then I won't keep him waiting. Clean up, Tyene, and keep practicing. I'll send Obara or Nymeria to give you another bout." Tyene bowed her head. "Yes, father." Oberyn left her behind, walking through the sunlit corridors until he reached the Solar, a comfortable chamber lined with shelves of scrolls and books. The windows overlooked the sea, and the breeze carried a briny tang into the room. Doran Martell sat in a wheeled chair by the window, carefully rolling up a parchment. He glanced at Oberyn's approach, nodding in greeting. "There you are," Doran said quietly. "I have news." Oberyn folded his arms. "From King's Landing?" "Yes." Doran patted the scroll. "Tywin Lannister has sent word that King Tommen's wedding to Margaery Tyrell is set to take place in 2 moons. They are requesting a Dornish envoy to attend the festivities, likely to display continued goodwill between our regions. It seems they want Myrcella to remain here, but they encourage us to send someone to represent Dorne at the royal wedding." Oberyn raised an eyebrow. "Encourage? Meaning it's not exactly an invitation but a command with polite trappings?" Doran gave a small shrug. "Precisely. Tywin wants to ensure that Dorne is seen to be cooperating. If we refuse, it might signal tension or hostility. If we comply, we are effectively participating in a demonstration of Lannister Tyrell power." He paused, letting the words settle. "I wonder if you might be inclined to go." "Me?" Oberyn scoffed. "After what happened in King's Landing, do you think Tywin truly wants me back in the capital? Or is this his attempt at forging some false sense of reconciliation?" "You know Tywin," Doran replied. "He is too pragmatic to let personal grudges interfere with political necessity, at least openly. He might believe your presence will reassure any doubters that the Martells and Lannisters have achieved a stable peace. Or, of course, he might be setting a trap. But refusing could do more harm than good, especially if we aim to keep the betrothal with Trystane and Myrcella intact." Oberyn considered it, recalling the flicker of hatred in Tywin's eyes the last time they'd spoken. Surely the old lion still burned with resentment. Yet if he declined the invitation, Dorn might appear aloof or even rebellious. I suppose, Oberyn said, exhaling. This is the price we pay for upholding our end of the betrothal alliance. If we want to keep lines of communication open and keep Myrcella safe, it might be wiser to accept. Doran gave a slow nod. I'm glad you see the sense in it, yet I do not wish you to go alone. Take Nymeria or Obara with you, perhaps, and Ilaria if she agrees. You'll need watchers at your back and as many eyes and ears as possible. We cannot trust King's Landing to be safe for you. A fleeting smile crossed Oberyn's lips. You doubt my ability to handle a few lurking assassins? It's not only about your skill, Oberyn. It's about cunning. In King's Landing, daggers come from unseen corners. Poison might lie in your cup. And you, my fiery brother, have already made quite an impression there. Oberyn tapped his fingers on the marble windowsill. Yes, that I have. Very well, I'll speak to Ilaria. I'll gather who I trust. We'll represent Dorn at the wedding. If Tywin thinks to cow me with pomp and spectacle, he will find himself disappointed. Doran's gaze drifted toward the sun-scorched horizon. Indeed, tread carefully, Oberyn. The realm is not stable. The more the Lannisters seek to shore up their power through this wedding, the more other factions might stir. Each time I receive a letter from King's Landing, there is another rumor of growing discontent. The Iron Bank, the broken remnants of Stannis' forces, the uncertain loyalty of certain river lords. Everyone is restless. Oberyn nodded, understanding the risks. I'll be mindful, and if Tywin is fool enough to try something direct, let him. That would only unify Dorn behind me even more. Before leaving, Oberyn bent to clasp Doran's hand. We'll show them that Dorn remains unbowed and unbroken. Always, Doran murmured. That evening, Oberyn dined with Ilaria in the warm glow of a lantern-lit balcony overlooking Sunspear's walls. The summer sea sprawled to the east, dark and vast. A gentle hush fell across the city at night, punctuated by laughter from distant taverns and the crash of waves on the rocks below. They drank a sweet, chilled Dornish red wine, nibbling on grilled peppers and spiced lamb. When Oberyn told Ilaria of the invitation to King Tommen's wedding, she studied his face in the flickering light. You mean to go back? She asked. Are you certain it's wise? Oberyn sighed, swirling the wine in his goblet. We have little choice if we want to maintain Dorn's position. Refusing would antagonize Tywin. Accepting might let me gauge the politics there and remind them we are not afraid. Ilaria's face was drawn with concern. So soon, you'll stand in the Red Keep once more? After what happened with Gregor? He reached across the table, took her hand. I know, but it's the path we must walk if we hope to keep Myrcella safe and maintain our leverage. I want you there with me if you're willing. I trust no one more than you, my love. She hesitated, memories of King's Landing's treacherous halls clearly playing in her mind. If that is your wish, Oberyn, I will accompany you. I will not let you face those lions alone. Good. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a tender kiss to her knuckles. We'll be careful this time. No unnecessary risks. I don't intend to be caught in any Lannister snares. Ilaria's eyes shone in the lamplight. I'll hold you to that. You are too precious to me, and to Dorn. So the decision was made. Over the next few days, Oberyn informed the Sand Snakes that he would travel to King's Landing once more, requesting that Nymeria and Obara accompany him. Tyene he left behind in Sunspear under Doran's watchful guidance, for he trusted Tyene's skill but felt she was best suited to tasks in Dorne for now. Nymeria Sand, with her cool confidence and skill in daggers, and Obara Sand, fierce with a spear or whip, would be more than enough to guard his flank. Furthermore, Oberyn and Ilaria would put on a display of Dornish pride and ease, suggesting to anyone watching that House Martell was secure in its position. In the weeks before departure, preparations were made. Horses readied for the long journey up the bone-dry roads, casks of Dornish wine selected as gifts, wardrobes of flowing silk and leather attire, each garment designed to showcase Dorne's vibrant style. Servants bustled about, double-checking that everything was in order. Myrcella and Trystane shyly bid them farewell on the day Oberyn and his party set out, the princess wearing a worried expression. She knew well how dangerous King's Landing could be. "Will you bring me word from my mother and Tommen?" Myrcella asked softly, as she stood with Trystane at the gates of Sunspear. A part of Oberyn saw how earnest she was, how she still loved her family despite the complex politics that surrounded them. Child though she was, Myrcella was not oblivious to the tensions. "I will," Oberyn promised, offering a courteous bow of his head. "Though I suspect your mother might not have many kind words for me, I'll ensure you hear whatever she wishes to share." Myrcella lowered her gaze, a hint of sadness flickering across her face. "I understand. Thank you." With that, Oberyn led the procession onto the winding desert roads. A dozen Dornish spearmen accompanied them, wearing light armor suited to the sweltering climate. Their banners were short spears emblazoned with the red sunburst of House Martell, snapping in the hot breeze. Obara and Nymeria rode close behind Oberyn and Ellaria. Obara wore practical leathers, her whip coiled at her hip, while Nymeria, in a fashionable riding dress that still allowed freedom of movement, kept a pair of daggers hidden at her waist. Ellaria wore a flowing gown of burnt orange, embroidered with swirling patterns reminiscent of the desert dunes. The journey to King's Landing took many days of hard riding, up through the Prince's Pass, across the Dornish marches, then winding northward. The nights brought cooler air, but the days were unrelentingly hot until they neared the Stormlands, where subtropical forests replaced the rocky deserts, and occasional rain showers gave respite. During the ride, Oberyn often reminisced with Obara and Nymeria about their childhood training, or told them stories of his travels across Essos in his youth. He wanted to keep the atmosphere light, despite the tension that crept into his thoughts each time they neared the capital. They encountered travelers and merchants along the way. Some recognized Oberyn's sigil and gave them wide berth. Others hailed him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. More than once, they heard passing references to the duel that had occurred months ago. "The Red Viper who killed the mountain," people whispered. Some even offered cheers. It amused Oberyn to see how quickly news and rumor had turned him into a legend, but he never let it go to his head. Legends could be undone by a single careless moment. As they approached the outskirts of King's Landing, the traffic on the roads thickened. Farmers with carts of vegetables jostled for space, with peddlers hawking cheap trinkets to travelers. A handful of gold-cloaked city watch patrolled near the gate, and when they caught sight of the Dornish banners, they snapped to attention, their faces betraying a certain wariness. No doubt they remembered the last time Oberyn Martell arrived in the city. The reek of the capital assailed them. Tanner's waste, rotting refuse, and the salty tang of the river. Oberyn wrinkled his nose. Even after all these years, the stench of King's Landing was an acquired taste he had never acquired. He exchanged a glance with Ellaria, who raised an eyebrow. "Still as foul as I remember," she murmured. At the gate, a gold-cloaked officer approached their retinue. His eyes slid from Oberyn to Obara and Nymeria, taking in their arms, then to Ellaria in her flowing gown. He cleared his throat, obviously anxious. "Prince Oberyn, my ladies," he said, struggling to keep his tone respectful. "Welcome to King's Landing. The hand of the king has arranged quarters for you in the Red Keep. We are to escort you." Oberyn nodded once. "Lead on, then. Let's not keep Lord Tywin waiting." And so they proceeded into the sprawling maze of King's Landing, the crowd parting to let them pass. Many recognized the red sun of House Martell. Some pointed, others murmured under their breath. Oberyn caught snatches of conversation. "He's back. That's him, the Dornish prince. Gods, does he mean to kill another lion?" Before long, they reached the drawbridge leading into the Red Keep. The castle's scarlet stone walls rose tall, the battlements crowded with guards who peered down at the arriving entourage. The gatehouse opened, and Oberyn's party rode into the outer courtyard, a memory stirring in Oberyn's mind of the last time he'd stood on these stones, facing Gregor Clegane in the dust of trial by combat. His stomach knotted briefly with old anger and old triumph, but he forced it down. Awaiting them in the courtyard were several figures of note. Cersei Lannister stood front and center, regal in a gown of gold and crimson, her hair styled in an elaborate cascade of curls. Next to her was Ser Jaime Lannister in Kingsguard white, his golden hand catching the sun's glare, and beside him stood a smaller man with mismatched eyes, Tyrion Lannister, wearing a rich black doublet. Oberyn felt a strange pang of recognition, for Tyrion was the man he had saved, the man whose cause he had championed in that fateful duel. Behind them, a line of attendants, guards, and courtiers formed, all eager to witness the Dornish arrival. Oberyn dismounted slowly, handing his reins to a stable boy who seemed nervous about coming too close to him. Ellaria slid gracefully from her saddle, Obara and Nymeria following suit. The three of them fanned out behind Oberyn, forming a small but formidable presence. Cersei stepped forward, her lips curving into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Prince Oberyn, we welcome you back to King's Landing for this auspicious occasion, the wedding of King Tommen and Margaery Tyrell. How good of you to grace us with your presence." Oberyn inclined his head slightly. "Queen Regent," he said, knowing that Tommen was technically the king, but that Cersei still wielded significant influence. "Congratulations on the upcoming wedding. It seems the city is abuzz with preparations." "Yes, well, we do what we must to secure the realm's future," Cersei replied, her tone smooth as polished glass. Her gaze flicked to Ellaria. "Lady Ellaria, a pleasure to see you as well." Ellaria returned a polite nod, no warmth in her voice. "Your Grace." Jaime nodded in greeting, though his expression was unreadable. "Prince Oberyn, Lady Ellaria," he said, looking each in the eye before his gaze drifted to the sand snakes. "And your daughters, I presume?" Obara raised her chin. "Obara Sand," she said simply, her posture radiating confidence. Nymeria offered a slight curtsy, stating her name in a quieter voice. Jaime nodded to each in turn. Then Tyrion stepped forward, a tentative smile touching his lips. "Prince Oberyn," he said, "you have my gratitude for coming to the royal wedding. My father he'll be pleased to see you." Oberyn almost laughed at the notion of Tywin being pleased, but he held his composure. "Lord Tyrion, or should I say Master of Coinstill?" Tyrion shrugged. "For now, the positions in King Tommen's small council shift as often as the tide. But yes, I hold the office, at least in name. Then I trust the realm's finances are in capable hands." A shadow flickered across Tyrion's eyes, as though he knew the realm's finances were in dire straits. "We do what we can," he said quietly. Cersei, apparently deciding the pleasantries had gone on long enough, motioned to a cluster of servants. "We've arranged for you to be housed in the Tower of the Hand. Lord Tywin insisted you be given suitable quarters. Perhaps you'd like to refresh yourselves from your journey before supper." The mention of the Tower of the Hand was not lost on Oberyn. That was Tywin's official seat of power within the Red Keep. Housing the Dornish party there suggested a mixture of courtesy and watchfulness. Still, Oberyn nodded. "That would be most welcome. Thank you." Cersei dismissed them with a polite smile, though Oberyn could see tension in the curve of her lips. The Lannisters might have invited him, but they were not overjoyed to see him. Oberyn turned to follow the servants who led them toward the Tower of the Hand. He caught Tyrion's eye just before leaving, and the dwarf gave him a slight, knowing nod. They would speak later, Oberyn guessed, likely away from watchful eyes. The Dornish party was escorted through broad corridors draped in crimson banners, the flicker of torches illuminating polished floors. At last, they reached the Tower of the Hand. The interior was spacious, though not as large as royal apartments. Still, it was grand enough. Plush carpets, tapestries depicting hunting scenes, and a series of comfortable bedchambers branching off a central common room. The windows offered a view of the city's rooftops and the far-off waters of Blackwater Bay. Once the servants bowed themselves out, Obara let out a snort. "They've put us right under Tywin's nose." Nymeria glanced at the array of Lannister sigils on the walls. "Are we to be guests or prisoners?" Ellaria crossed to the window, letting the breeze play with the ends of her dark hair. "Guests for now, but we should keep our wits about us." Oberyn, leaning his spear against a wall, let out a soft chuckle. All of you sound as though you expect an attack in the night. Tywin is more subtle than that. We need to watch for the hidden knives. Let him try, Oberyn said fiercely. I'm ready. Subtlety, my dear daughter, Oberyn cautioned. If Tywin wanted to kill us outright, he wouldn't summon us to the capital. His methods will be more insidious, attempts to isolate us, to find leverage, to sow discord. Let's not give him openings. Nymeria's brows drew together. What about the wedding itself? It'll be a massive event. Dignitaries from across the realm, feasting, dancing. If Tywin wants to display Lannister power, then we make certain Dorne does not appear cowed, Oberyn finished. We attend with pride. We show courtesy but not subservience, and we watch carefully. Ellaria turned from the window. We should also be mindful of how we speak of Myrcella. She is Tywin's granddaughter, after all. If we speak too freely about her position here in Dorne, it might raise suspicions or anger. Best to tread lightly on that matter. Oberyn nodded. Agreed. They set about settling into their rooms, washing off the dust of travel, changing into fresh Dornish attire. Oberyn chose a tunic of warm ochre silk, trimmed with gold snake motifs, along with soft leather breeches. He slipped a dagger into his belt, always preferring to keep a weapon at hand in the Red Keep. Ellaria donned a flowing gown of pale yellow that complemented her tawny complexion. Oberyn and Nymeria each selected more subdued dresses than usual, though both wore belts fitted with hidden blades. That evening, a small supper was hosted in their honor in one of the Red Keep's lesser halls. Only a handful of courtiers were in attendance, along with Tyrion Lannister and several members of the small council. Tywin himself was conspicuously absent, perhaps busy with wedding preparations or perhaps pointedly avoiding Oberyn's presence, doubtless not wanting to share a table with the man who had undone his champion. Still, Oberyn would have liked to see the old lion's face, just to gauge his mood. The empty chair at the head of the table spoke volumes. The meal was a lavish affair of roasted pheasant, honey-glazed carrots, and delicate pastries shaped like roses, an apparent nod to the Tyrell presence in the capital. As they ate, Oberyn made small talk with Mace Tyrell, who dominated the table's conversation with boasts of Highgarden's wealth and bountiful harvests. The portly lord seemed eager to impress the Dornish guests with talk of how his daughter, Marjorie, was the most beloved queen-to-be the realm had ever seen. At one point, Tyrion leaned in toward Oberyn and murmured, "My father regrets he cannot attend this evening. Some urgent matter demanded his attention. Or so he says." Oberyn gave a small shrug. "It's no surprise. He wants to keep his distance, and keep me guessing." Tyrion's mismatched eyes flicked briefly to Ellaria, who was in quiet conversation with a few ladies from the Reach. Then he lowered his voice further. "A word of caution. Cersei is still furious about the outcome of your trial by combat. She may attempt to provoke you in any subtle way she can. Don't give her the satisfaction of an outburst." "Thank you for the advice," Oberyn replied, his tone equally low. "I'll keep it in mind. And watch your wine," Tyrion added with a grim twist of his mouth. "Poison has become a frequent rumor in these halls ever since King Joffrey's wedding, and we both know how that ended." His expression darkened. Joffrey's death by poison had been pinned on Tyrion originally, though he was ultimately exonerated by the trial that led to the duel. Oberyn tilted his head in agreement. Duly noted. By the time the supper concluded, little had been said of real importance, yet the tension beneath the pleasantries was palpable. Oberyn noted how certain courtiers eyed him with a mix of awe and fear. They remembered how he had dispatched the mountain. He also observed the keen interest the Tyrells showed in any mention of Dorne, likely trying to discern the strength of House Martell's armies or alliances. Mace Tyrell even clapped Oberyn on the shoulder at one point, declaring, "We must keep the peace, mustn't we? The Tyrells and the Martells, both pillars of the realm." Oberyn responded with polite smiles, never fully trusting the man's buoyant talk. When they returned to their quarters in the Tower of the Hand, Oberyn decided to take a night watch from the ramparts, wanting to assess the guard rotations. Nymeria, for her part, began methodically checking the corners of the rooms for hidden passages. Ellaria drew Oberyn aside. "We're going to be under constant scrutiny, Oberyn. This wedding's a stage. Tywin means to play it flawlessly." "I know," Oberyn said, running a hand through his hair. "But if we can glean insights on the Lannister debts, on their relationship with the Tyrells, on any fracturing alliances, then we can bring that knowledge back to Dorne. Could be invaluable." Ellaria rested her hands on his shoulders, standing close. "Be careful," she repeated, her voice soft. "We only need one misstep for everything to fall apart." He lowered his forehead to hers, inhaling her familiar scent. "I swear it. I'm not the same vengeful man I was when I faced the mountain. I won't let my anger lead me astray." Yet as night fell and Oberyn tried to sleep, memories of that fight flashed behind his closed lids. Gregor's massive form, the spear's thrust, the surge of triumph. It was a reminder of how quickly life could be snatched away by one miscalculation. This time, he would not make the same mistake of showboating or letting his guard drop. He was in the lion's den, and the lion's den had many hidden traps besides the fangs of Gregor Clegane. The next few days passed in a blur of wedding preparations. King Tommen's wedding to Margaery Tyrell would take place in the Great September of Baelor, followed by feasting and tournaments. The city hummed with excitement or dread, depending on whom you asked. Workmen decorated the streets with garlands of flowers, the smell of roses overlaying the city's usual stench. Vendors set up stalls hawking commemorative pins bearing the crowned staglion sigil of the Baratheons entwined with the golden rose of House Tyrell. Everywhere Oberyn turned, he saw the Tyrells' influence. Wagon loads of food from the Reach, wagons of flowers in full bloom, and throngs of Tyrell bannermen milling about the city. He also noticed an undercurrent of tension among the locals. The small folk muttered that they had been forced to endure multiple lavish weddings while they starved. Not long ago, Joffrey's wedding had ended in tragedy. Poison for the king, chaos for the guests. Some feared the same might happen again. Others joked grimly that perhaps the Tyrell bride would bury yet another king husband. Oberyn listened to these whispers with a carefully blank expression. He was here to observe, not to meddle in the small folks' gossip. Nonetheless, it was a reminder that King's Landing was a cauldron of rumor and resentment. On the second morning after their arrival, as Oberyn and Ellaria strolled through the Red Keep's gardens, they found Tyrion waiting for them under an arbor of climbing roses. He wore a plain jerkin, as if to avoid drawing attention. He beckoned them closer, a wry smile on his lips. "Prince Oberyn, Lady Ellaria," he greeted. "Might I steal a moment of your time?" Oberyn exchanged a glance with Ellaria. She gave a slight nod, and they stepped into the shade of the arbor. Bees buzzed among the flowers, and the faint clamor of the castle's bustle echoed in the distance. Tyrion checked that no one else was near, then lowered his voice. "I've heard rumors in the council chambers," Tyrion began. "Nothing definitive, but concerning enough. Certain Braavosi bankers have arrived in the city, demanding audiences with the Hand regarding outstanding crown debts. My father has been elusive, of course, but the Iron Bank is not known for patience when it comes to collecting what's owed." Oberyn's eyes narrowed. "And how does that concern Dorne?" Tyrion shrugged. "If the Lannisters cannot satisfy the Iron Bank, the crown's finances might collapse. This wedding is costing an enormous sum, and if the Tyrells feel they're carrying too much of the burden, friction may arise. The truth is, my father is juggling knives right now. One slip, and it all comes crashing down." Ellaria folded her arms, a thoughtful look crossing her face. "This might be an opportunity for us," she said slowly. "Dorne has resources, merchant ships, spices, wines. Though not as wealthy as the Reach, we are not struggling in the same way the Crown seems to be." "Precisely," Tyrion said. "If you were to, say, extend some form of credit or trade arrangement to the Crown, under terms favorable to Dorne, it might give you leverage. Or, at the very least, an avenue for negotiation that doesn't involve swords." Oberyn studied Tyrion carefully. "Why do you tell us this? The last time you and I spoke of your father, you made it clear you cannot openly move against him." Tyrion's mouth quirked, I still cannot openly undermine him, but I can see the writing on the wall. If the Iron Bank demands repayment, and the Lannisters cannot produce it, it could spark chaos. I'd rather see a controlled shift of power, ideally one that spares the realm another war. You truly think Tywin's hold is that precarious? Ellaria asked. Precarious might be too strong a word, but he spent a fortune on wars, bribes, and marriages, all to maintain Lannister dominance. Now that the gold mines of the Westerlands have run dry, the crown is deeply in debt. Tyrion paused, glancing around once more to ensure no eavesdroppers lurked. The Tyrells have footed many of the wedding expenses. My father cannot afford to alienate them, but he hates being reliant on them. Meanwhile, the Iron Bank looms, unamused by Lannister excuses. Oberyn let the information sink in. So the old lion stands on shifting sands, he murmured. And your advice to me is to offer a hand or a push? Tyrion gave a half-smile. That depends on what you ultimately want. If you wish to avoid open conflict, you might do well to slip in as a quiet partner. Offer the crown a Dornish line of credit or supply route that helps ease the financial strain in exchange for concessions. A bigger say in council decisions, for example, or better terms for Myrcella's eventual inheritance. Or if you want war, he spread his hands. Well, letting the Lannisters drown in debt is one way to begin. But I sense your brother, Prince Doran, prefers more measured steps. Ellaria's brow furrowed as she weighed the possibilities. We do not desire another war, she said softly. Dorne has shed enough blood, but we also won't be content to remain overshadowed. If there's a chance for us to gain influence without swords, that might be worth considering. Tyrion inclined his head. Precisely. I merely pass along this information. Do with it what you will. My father tries to keep these matters hush-hush, but word spreads among the bankers and their envoys. Oberyn studied the dwarf for a moment, recalling how Tyrion had once been on trial for regicide, how Oberyn's championing had saved him from a gruesome end. Tyrion seemed genuine, but he was still a Lannister. Thank you for the warning, Oberyn said finally. We'll keep it in mind. Tyrion nodded, stepping out from under the roses into the sunlight. I'll leave you to your morning stroll. Until we speak again, my prince. With a respectful dip of his head, he departed, disappearing around a hedge corner. For a while, Oberyn and Ellaria remained there among the flowers and buzzing bees, each lost in thought. Eventually, Ellaria said, If Tywin truly is juggling knives, then we are in a stronger position than we realized. But we can't act rashly. Oberyn nodded. We'll wait, observe. Then I'll send word to Doran. See what he thinks of offering the crown some help. Could be an interesting gambit. They left the gardens and made their way back to the Tower of the Hand to share what they'd learned with Obara and Nymeria. Both sisters listened intently, with Obara tapping her whip handle against her thigh and Nymeria's expression thoughtful. So we could become the crown's creditors, in essence? Nymeria asked. That would be a subtle hold over them. They default, we claim certain rights or privileges. Potentially, yes, Oberyn confirmed, but it also ties us to their fortunes. If the crown collapses entirely, we might lose whatever we invest. Still, it might be a strategic risk. Obara shook her head. I prefer the simpler approach. Seize advantage on the battlefield when the Lannisters are weak. But I know that's not Doran's style. Oberyn gave a half-smile. We learned the cost of direct confrontation centuries ago, WH. And we fought the Targaryens. Dorne's strength lies in resilience and cunning. Let's not forget that. Just then, a knock sounded at the door. Nymeria went to open it, revealing a red keep servant who bowed. Prince Oberyn, the Queen Regent requests your presence in her solar. Oberyn lifted an eyebrow. Did she say why? The servant shook his head nervously. No, my lord. Only that she'd like to speak with you at once. Ellaria's gaze darted to Oberyn in warning. Careful, she whispered under her breath. Oberyn sighed. Let me see what the lioness wants. Obara, Nymeria, stay vigilant. Then he donned a calm facade and followed the servant through the corridors. The hush of the red keep thickened around him, as though the stones themselves held breath, waiting. Soon, the servant led him to a well-appointed solar with high-arched windows overlooking the city. Rich carpets covered the floor, and a table was laid with goblets, a pitcher of wine, and a platter of figs and dates. Cersei Lannister stood by the window, her gold gown catching the sunlight. Ser Meryn Trant of the Kingsguard lurked near the wall, face as impassive as carved granite. "Prince Oberyn," Cersei greeted him, turning with a regal air. "Thank you for coming." Oberyn gave a short bow. "Queen Regent." She gestured for him to sit. He complied, taking a seat on one of the cushioned chairs. Cersei settled opposite him, her green eyes fixed on his face. "I trust your accommodations are adequate?" "They suffice," Oberyn said mildly, though he made no effort to hide the slight dryness in his tone. Cersei poured wine into 2 goblets, offering one to Oberyn. He studied it for a moment, recalling Tyrion's warning about poison, but he took it in hand, not drinking yet. She took a sip from her own goblet first. "You still distrust me," she remarked, noticing his hesitation. Oberyn gave her a faint smile. "It's wise to be cautious, given our history." Cersei set down her goblet. "I won't waste our time with false pleasantries. You and I know the wound that lies between our houses. My brother Tyrion might think it's all in the past now that you killed Ser Gregor, but I understand that old grudges rarely die so easily." Oberyn inclined his head. "You are more perceptive than some might believe, Your Grace." Her lips tightened slightly. "I also know you have Myrcella in Dorne. A betrothal, yes, but let's not pretend she isn't a hostage of sorts. She's my daughter. It was your father's doing, sending her to Dorne," Oberyn replied, his voice even. "He wanted an alliance." "Yes, father's idea." She let a spark of annoyance flit through her eyes, then continued. "I love my children, Prince Oberyn. I want them safe. Tommen is about to wed Margaery Tyrell, which ties us to the Reach. But Myrcella is far away, and I worry for her. I want your word that she remains unharmed." Oberyn sipped the wine at last, finding it surprisingly sweet. "My word? I can give you my promise that no harm will come to her from House Martell. She is well treated, cared for, even liked by many in Dorne. She and Prince Trystane get on quite well." Cersei's eyes narrowed. "That's good to hear. Still, if anything should happen to her, He interrupted before she could utter a threat. "You'd burn Dorne to the ground, yes, so you've said in so many words before. But consider this, as long as Myrcella is in Dorne, the Lannisters have an incentive to keep the peace. It goes both ways, Your Grace." She pressed her lips together in a thin line. "Just be certain you keep her safe, or the consequences would be dire," Oberyn finished with a small shrug. "I understand, and so does my brother, Prince Doran. We've no intention of endangering the princess." Cersei exhaled sharply, then shifted the topic. "I hear you've been speaking with Tyrion. Whatever he promises you, remember he's always angling for his own benefit. My father tolerates him out of necessity, but he doesn't speak for House Lannister. Does that mean you do?" Oberyn asked, arching a brow. A hint of a smile tugged at Cersei's mouth. "I may not have the formal title of hand, but I have enough influence to ensure that if you cross us, the retaliation will be swift and severe. I just want you to keep that in mind, Prince Oberyn. We can coexist in a polite manner for now. But if you see an advantage in stirring up trouble, if you think to use Myrcella as a pawn, I will not stand idle." Oberyn studied her for a long moment. She was so different from Myrcella. Cold, proud, shaped by the hardness of King's Landing. Yet her devotion to her children was genuine, if twisted at times. "I have no wish to harm your daughter. I had my vengeance on the man who killed my sister. That matter, as far as I am concerned, rests. I do not plan to incite further violence, but I also will not kneel." Cersei flicked her gaze aside, perhaps stifling a retort. Then she rose from her seat, crossing to the window. "I suppose that will do for now. The wedding is soon. Ensure your presence is suitably respectful." The king will want to see the princes of Dorne and the Reach honoring him. Oberyn stood, too. He set down the goblet, still nearly full. He had no desire to linger and finish it. "We'll attend the ceremonies and festivities," he said. "Don't worry. We'll be the picture of Dornish elegance." She turned back to face him, face set in an inscrutable mask. "We'll see." That ended the meeting. Oberyn inclined his head in a gesture of departure and left, striding into the corridor where the same servant waited to escort him back to the Tower of the Hand. As he walked, he let his mind replay every word. Cersei was worried about Myrcella, determined to keep the upper hand, yet reliant on Tywin's larger game. She was as dangerous as ever, though in a corner of her heart she acted out of maternal concern. Back in the Tower of the Hand, Oberyn shared the conversation with Ellaria and the Sand Snakes. Obara bristled at the implied threat, while Nymeria looked pensive. Ellaria said softly, "She'll never be at ease with Myrcella in our custody. That alone might make her more reckless." Oberyn nodded. "We'll need to watch her, and watch Tywin too. Something tells me they're not entirely aligned on how to manage us." A day later, the wedding arrived, bright and splendid. King Tommen, a boy king of perhaps 9 or 10 years, wore robes of deep crimson edged with gold thread. Margaery Tyrell was radiant in a gown of ivory silk and golden roses. The great September of Baelor overflowed with lords, ladies, and onlookers. The High Sparrow himself presided over the ceremony with gravitas, though Oberyn could see, in the corner of his eye, the flickers of disapproval from the more impoverished faithful who had gathered outside the Sept's doors, straining to catch a glimpse of the extravagance. Oberyn's seat was near the front, among the High Lords. Next to him sat Ellaria, both dressed in vibrant Dornish style. Oberyn in a sleek ensemble of orange and gold, Ellaria in turquoise embroidered with desert flowers. Obara and Nymeria stood behind them, ever watchful. Across the aisle, the Tyrells appeared in full flourish. Mace Tyrell beaming, Olenna Tyrell wearing her distinctive headdress and a sharp glint in her eyes. Cersei stood near her son, regal yet tense, while Jaime and the other Kingsguard kept guard close at hand. Tyrion was off to one side, looking bored but studious, perhaps analyzing every detail. The ceremony proceeded without incident. Vows were exchanged. The High Sparrow extolled the virtues of marriage, and Tommen placed a crown of gold roses on Margaery's head. The watchers applauded politely, and a flourish of trumpets sounded. Oberyn surveyed the crowd discreetly, no sign of immediate strife. The Lannisters and Tyrells seemed eager to display a unified front. If there was any sabotage afoot, it would likely come at the feasts and banquets afterward. And so they all poured out of the sept into the bright midday sun, the new king and queen leading a grand procession back to the Red Keep. Streets were lined with cheering throngs, though Oberyn detected a mixture of real enthusiasm for Margaery and forced cheers for Tommen. The city watch kept order, preventing any disruptions. Flower petals rained down from balconies, the air sweet with perfume. It was a vision of regal splendor, quite at odds with the stories of poverty and unrest that Oberyn knew lay just beyond the main routes. Eventually, they reached the Red Keep's outer courtyard, where the wedding feast would be held beneath colorful pavilions. Hundreds of tables were arranged, bearing roasted boar, platters of fish, fresh fruits, and sweetmeats. Wine flowed freely from casks. Jugglers, musicians, and acrobats performed for the crowd's delight. Tommen and Margaery were seated at a raised dais, with Cersei and Tywin to their right, and the Tyrell clan to their left. Oberyn, Ellaria, and the Sand Snakes had a place of honor at one of the front tables, far enough to be below the royal dais, yet close enough that everyone would see them. Throughout the feast, Oberyn engaged in polite conversation with neighboring lords. He noticed the curious stares from all corners. Many likely recalled how Oberyn had participated in the previous royal wedding's aftermath, albeit indirectly, by championing Tyrion in the trial that followed. No one dared voice the memory openly, but it lay in the air like a silent specter. When the boar was brought out, gleaming with a honey glaze, Mace Tyrell boomed a loud toast to King Tommen. The guests raised their cups. Oberyn lifted his own goblet but only sipped. He'd already resolved to keep his wits about him. Ilaria did the same, her eyes scanning the dais where Tommen and Margaery sat. It was a delicate balance, showing enough enjoyment not to insult the hosts, yet staying alert for any sign of duplicity. At one point, Tywin Lannister rose from his seat to address the gathering. The crowd fell silent at once. Tywin was dressed in severe black and gold, his face composed, posture regal. "Lords and ladies," he began, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "We stand at a moment of unity for the realm. The crown and the reach are joined in marriage, sealing a bond that will bring prosperity to all. House Lannister, for its part, pledges unwavering support to King Tommen and Queen Margaery." He paused, glancing around. His gaze settled briefly on Oberyn, just a fraction of a second, before moving on. "I am pleased to see so many loyal bannermen here today, including honored guests from Dorne. May this alliance stand as a beacon for peace. We have endured enough war, enough division. Let this union usher in an age of stability and prosperity." A polite wave of applause rippled through the crowd. Oberyn joined in with measured claps, meeting Tywin's fleeting look with his own steady stare. The old lion had grown older still in the months since Oberyn had last seen him. Lines etched deeper into his face, hair almost entirely white. Yet there was no mistaking the hardness in Tywin's green eyes. Despite the gracious words, Oberyn knew Tywin's mind was always calculating. This speech was for show, part of the facade of unity. Behind the scenes, Tywin was likely dealing with the Iron Bank, the Tyrell demands, and the simmering tensions that threatened his hold on power. As the feast wore on, and the sun crept lower, entertainments multiplied. Performers juggled fire, dwarfs reenacted comedic takes on famous battles, a spectacle that made Tyrion glare, though he tried to hide it, and bards sang ballads praising the union of Tommen and Margaery. Oberyn seized the opportunity to mingle. He left the table with Illyria's hand in his, weaving through the clusters of courtiers. Occasionally, he paused to exchange pleasantries with a lord from the Vale or a lady from the Reach, gleaning bits of gossip. Discontented talk of taxes, news of petty rebellions in the Riverlands, rumors that Stannis Baratheon might still be alive and rallying a new force. Little morsels that, combined, painted a picture of a realm still uneasy despite the new king's crowning. Near a table laden with sweets, Oberyn spotted Olenna Tyrell, the formidable Queen of Thorns. She sat fanning herself, a sharp-eyed old woman in a headdress that resembled a blooming rose. She beckoned Oberyn closer with a coy twitch of her fingers. Curious, he approached Illyria at his side. "Prince Oberyn," Olenna said brightly, as if greeting a dear friend. "I recall your presence at the last wedding that ended in tragedy. I do hope we're to avoid any such excitement today." Oberyn dipped his head in respect. "That is my hope as well, Lady Olenna. The day has gone smoothly so far." She sked softly. "It has indeed, though I find these grand feasts dull. Too many people, too many toasts, and I'm far too old for this nonsense." But Margaery insisted on a lavish affair. "We Tyrells never do anything by half measures, you see." Her gaze flicked to Illyria. "You must be Lady Illyria Sand. My goodness, you're quite the beauty, aren't you?" Illyria offered a polite smile. "You flatter me, Lady Olenna." Olenna waved a hand. "I speak the truth. I've always admired Dornish fashions and Dornish frankness. Unlike these simpering court ladies who do nothing but fawn over whichever man is in power." She lowered her voice, glancing around. "Tell me, Prince Oberyn, have you heard the rumors that the Iron Bank's envoys departed the city this morning with sour expressions? It seems they did not get what they wanted from Lord Tywin." Oberyn's pulse quickened. "I had heard murmurs that they were dissatisfied." Olenna gave a cat-like grin. "Dissatisfied is putting it mildly. A few of my friends in the city told me the bankers threatened to call in certain debts, or else finance certain other claimants to the throne. One never knows with these bravosi. They're cold-blooded, like snakes. No offense to your moniker, of course." "None taken," Oberyn said smoothly. "But if the Iron Bank is displeased, that could mean trouble for the crown." Olenna leaned back in her chair, tapping her fan against her knee. "We Tyrells have poured a great deal of gold into the crown's coffers to keep them afloat. My dear Mace may bluster about our endless reserves, but even the Reach doesn't have bottomless pockets. If the crown's debts fall on our shoulders entirely, we'll be none too pleased. Lord Tywin knows it, of course. He's a cunning old lion. But cunning only goes so far when actual coin is demanded." Illyria's eyes flicked to Oberyn, a spark of shared interest. "That does put the realm in a precarious position, my lady. The Tyrells, as the crown's strongest financial supporters, must be wary." Olenna sighed. "Wary indeed. Oh well, I'm too ancient for these complexities. But if something were to tilt the scales, as it were, I suspect many at court would reevaluate their alliances. Just a thought for you." She gave them a meaning-laden smile, then rose from her seat. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I must see to my granddaughter's new mother-in-law. With any luck, I can avoid strangling Cersei with my bare hands." With that wry parting, she shuffled away, leaving Oberyn and Illyria to digest her words. Illyria spoke first, her voice a low murmur. "It's not just Tyrion telling us about the debt crisis now. Olenna confirms it from a Tyrell perspective. House Tyrell might not want to keep bailing out the crown if the Iron Bank comes demanding its due. And if the Tyrells withdraw their support," Oberyn began. "The crown collapses," Illyria finished quietly. It was a potent piece of intelligence. Tywin's iron grip might be loosening if the Tyrells ever decided they'd had enough. As the feast continued, Oberyn's mind spun with possibilities. Could Dorne exploit this subtle rift? Could they strengthen their own position by offering an alternative line of financial or political support, or by quietly encouraging the Tyrells to withdraw theirs? Or was it too risky, possibly triggering a war? He drifted toward the dais at one point, half intent on gauging Tywin's mood firsthand. But Cersei was at Tywin's side, engaged in a low-voiced discussion, and Jaime stood close by. The old lion's face revealed nothing beyond a calm exterior. Only once did Tywin glance Oberyn's way. Their eyes met, and Oberyn thought he glimpsed a flicker of unease deep in Tywin's gaze, quickly masked. Then Tywin turned back to the conversation at hand, ignoring Oberyn. Eventually, the feast drew to a close as dusk settled over the city. The newlyweds were escorted away amid cheers, the crowd slowly dispersing, many guests stumbling in varying states of drunkenness. No one had died or been poisoned this time, though Oberyn could not help but notice certain tensions had deepened. The Tyrells were flush with a queen in place, but they might not be so eager to endlessly fund the Lannister regime. The Iron Bank had left unhappy. The small folk seemed resentful. All signs that Tywin's carefully balanced structure might topple if pressured from the right angle. Returning to the Tower of the Hand, Oberyn convened with Illyria, Obara, and Nymeria. They discussed everything they had gleaned. Olenna's hints, Tyrion's warnings, the subdued looks on the bankers' faces. Then they considered how best to proceed. Illyria favored caution, Obara advocated a more direct confrontation, perhaps meeting with the Tyrells to see if there was common cause to dethrone the Lannisters, while Nymeria urged subtlety in any approach. In the end, Oberyn decided to send a detailed raven to Doran, outlining the developments and requesting guidance. They had come to King's Landing merely to attend the wedding and reaffirm that Dorne was not an enemy. But this new information about the crown's finances and the Tyrell-Lannister tensions could open doors. Oberyn wanted Doran's perspective before doing anything that might backfire. As the days after the wedding passed, Oberyn found himself invited to more gatherings. Smaller feasts, private dinners, discreet meetings with lords from the Vale, the Stormlands, and beyond. Word had spread that Oberyn Martell was a man worth knowing, not just because of his dramatic victory over the mountain, but because Dorne now held the king's own niece, Myrcella, and had resources that might prove vital if the crown's finances stumbled. Oberyn tread carefully through these social entanglements, collecting tidbits of information like a viper quietly flicking its tongue to taste the air. In the swirl of rumor and flattery, he kept his dagger sharp and his mind sharper. One evening, Tyrion arranged a private dinner in a modest courtyard inside the Red Keep. Only Oberyn, Illyria, Jaime, and Tyrion attended. They dined on spiced goat and drank from a single decanter of Arbor Red. Tyrion insisted on a single shared vessel to ease any fears of poisoning. Jaime said little through most of the meal, occasionally glancing at his golden hand with a hint of melancholy. Tyrion led the conversation. "So the wedding went smoothly," Tyrion said with a sardonic grin. "No one died, no one was arrested, and father didn't threaten to disinherit me. By King's Landing standards, it was a grand success." Ellaria smiled faintly. "It was impressive, though the cost must have been astronomical." Jaime snorted. "House Tyrell footed the majority of it, or so father claims. The rest came from crown coffers, what's left of them." Tyrion poured more wine. "Prince Oberyn, have you considered my earlier suggestion about the crown's need for outside assistance?" Oberyn weighed his words carefully, noting Jaime's curious look. "I have, but Dorne prefers to move cautiously." Jaime looked between them. "Outside assistance? What are you talking about?" Tyrion cleared his throat. "Merely the possibility that if the Iron Bank demands repayment, the crown might seek new lines of credit or trade deals. Dorne could step in, for a price." Jaime frowned, swirling his wine. "You want the Martells dictating terms to us? Father would never allow that." "Father may not have a choice," Tyrion said, a hint of sharpness in his tone. "If the Iron Bank cuts off funds and the Tyrells balk at paying more, how else do we sustain the crown's obligations? We can't just conjure gold from thin air." Jaime pressed his lips together. "He'll find a way. He always does." Oberyn decided to test the waters. "And if he doesn't?" A tense silence hung over the table. Jaime finally muttered, "Then the realm might tear itself apart. Again." Oberyn sighed inwardly. This was the heart of the matter. Did anyone truly want another war? Another wave of bloodshed? The War of the Five Kings had already cost countless lives. Even the Martells, who had not borne the worst of the fighting, were weary of the realm's instability. Dorne wanted justice, yes, but not at the cost of total chaos. Ellaria spoke up, voice gentle. "None of us wants to see the realm in flames, Ser Jaime. Not even Prince Oberyn. But sometimes, refusing to adapt invites greater disaster." Tyrion nodded. "Well said, my lady. My father's greatest strength is also his greatest weakness, his refusal to bend. If the crown's finances crack under the weight, the realm suffers. Lannister pride won't matter when rebellion flares." Jaime looked away, clearly torn between loyalty to Tywin and a growing awareness of the precarious situation. "So what do you propose, Tyrion?" "That we beg the Martells for gold." Tyrion waved a hand. "Beg is such a harsh word. Negotiate, perhaps. Let the Martells bring in trade caravans, open shipping lanes, route commerce through Sunspear. In return, the crown acknowledges certain Dornish privileges, maybe grants seats on the small council that have real power. It's a compromise that spares us from the Iron Bank's wrath. Or at least buys time to pay them off." Oberyn studied Jaime's reaction. The Kingslayer seemed uneasy, but not outright dismissive. "If Tywin were to consider such a proposal, we'd expect genuine concessions," Oberyn said. "Not hollow titles or worthless trinkets. Dorne hasn't forgotten Elaya's murder, nor the years of slighting that followed." Jaime looked at him with a flash of discomfort. "I understand. But my father—" He paused, searching for the right words. "He sees what happened to Elia as a necessary evil in the war's context. He'll never apologize. But perhaps he'd agree to more tangible gestures of goodwill if it secures Tommen's throne." Tyrion leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting. "So you'd at least put the idea to him?" Jaime let out a long breath. "I can try. He may snarl at me or ignore me, but I'll try. Father wants stability above all, even if it stings his pride." Ellaria and Oberyn exchanged a look. This was a surprising turn. Jaime Lannister, champion of House Lannister, was tentatively opening a door to compromise. Perhaps he saw that the realm was on the brink of disaster if old grudges continued to rule. Or perhaps he simply feared another full-scale war. "Good," Oberyn finally said. We'll inform Prince Doran. If Tywin is willing to talk, Dorne will listen. A fragile sense of possibility settled over the table. They finished the meal in an awkward camaraderie, each aware that they stood on the edge of a significant shift. The hours rolled toward midnight, and Tyrion and Jaime departed, leaving Oberyn and Ellaria alone in the courtyard, the sky overhead littered with stars. Ellaria slipped her arm through Oberyn's. Do you think this could actually lead to peace? Real peace, not a forced truce. He gazed up at the stars. A part of me doubts it. Tywin is too rigid. But perhaps if he sees no other way to maintain power, he'll yield some ground. We might secure better treatment for Dorne, a confession of sorts. Maybe not a public apology, but some official recognition that Elia was wronged. Or, at the very least, real authority for Dorne in the council. She tilted her head onto his shoulder. It sounds almost too hopeful. I know, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. But we can't stand still. The realm is changing around us, and we must adapt. The next morning, Oberyn penned a lengthy message to Doran, detailing the potential negotiations and the precarious state of the crown's finances. He emphasized that the Tyrells seemed restless about continuing to finance the throne, that the Iron Bank was on the verge of punitive action, and that Tyrion and Jaime were quietly open to making deals. He sealed the letter with the Martell sigil and dispatched it via Raven at dawn. That day, he expected little of note to happen, only to be summoned unexpectedly to a meeting in the Tower of the Hand, where Tywin Lannister awaited him. A royal steward delivered the summons, bowing stiffly at Oberyn's door. Obara and Nymeria exchanged glances. Both offered to accompany Oberyn, but the steward insisted the meeting was to be private. Lord Tywin said Prince Oberyn alone, the steward repeated. Ellaria looked wary, but Oberyn decided to go. If Tywin wanted him alone, that suggested something delicate was at hand. He climbed the winding stairs to the top floor of the Tower of the Hand, to a sumptuously appointed solar that Tywin used for private audiences. Guards stood outside the door, but upon Oberyn's approach, they stepped aside, letting him enter. Inside, Tywin Lannister sat behind a large oak desk, dressed in black doublet and breeches. A single candle burned on the desk, though sunlight poured through the windows, making the candle superfluous. The old lion's face was inscrutable as Oberyn closed the door behind him. "Prince Oberyn," Tywin said in greeting, voice as cold and precise as ever. "Sit." Oberyn took the seat across from him, crossing one leg over the other. "You wanted to speak with me, Lord Tywin?" Tywin steepled his fingers. "I did. Rumors reach me that you have been conversing with certain individuals, the Queen of Thorns, my son Tyrion, perhaps others, about matters of crown finance. I would know your intentions." Oberyn inclined his head. "Not surprising that you hear such rumors. My intentions are to secure the safety and prosperity of Dorne. If that requires discussing the crown's precarious finances, so be it." A flicker of annoyance crossed Tywin's face. "I'll not mince words. The crown is in debt. The Tyrells help mitigate that burden, but they are not an endless purse. The Iron Bank remains insistent on repayment. If you're considering exploiting these circumstances, I'll remind you that House Lannister's reach is long." "Is that a threat?" Oberyn asked, voice calm. "Because I can remind you that Myrcella is in Dorne, safe and under our care, and that the Martells command substantial forces. I don't think it would be wise for us to threaten each other openly. Do you?" Tywin's jaw tightened. "I merely state facts. The question is whether House Martell might see advantage in offering cooperation rather than sabotage." Oberyn let a small smile tug at his lips. "Cooperation, you say? Some would find that word surprising, coming from you." Tywin didn't smile. "Let me be clear. You killed Ser Gregor. That was a blow to House Lannister's reputation, but the crown abides by the trial's outcome. We accepted it. As for your sister Elia, the matter is past. I will not revisit or apologize for it, but I see no reason to let older grudges overshadow the realm's future." Oberyn's chest tightened at the reference to Elia, but he forced his voice to remain steady. You speak as if it were a trifling thing, Lord Tywin, but we both know it was no small matter. My sister was murdered, and you ordered it." Tywin's eyes flashed, but he kept his composure. "I made decisions necessary to end the war quickly. I will not apologize for doing what was needed to secure the realm. That war is long over. Now we face new challenges. So your stance is that all is forgiven and forgotten?" Oberyn's tone was sardonic. "You'd prefer I bury my sister's memory for the good of the realm?" Tywin leaned forward, voice dropping. "Justice has been served, to your mind, by the death of Gregor. If you want more, you will not get it from me. But if you want Dorne to prosper, if you want to ensure your children, and your brother's children, inherit a kingdom that is not plunged into chaos, then you will negotiate. We can formalize new trade routes, supply agreements, and perhaps a seat on the small council. In return, Dorne will help stabilize the crown's finances through commerce, or direct assistance if you so choose." Oberyn studied Tywin's face, seeing no flicker of remorse, no admission of guilt. The old lion was purely pragmatic, offering a cold handshake across the table of politics. And Oberyn realized that if he pressed for more than Tywin was willing to give, the conversation would end in hostility. The question was, did he want that hostility now, or did the realm and Dorne stand to gain from a grudging partnership? "You want us to prop up your finances so you can keep the Iron Bank at bay," Oberyn said. "And for that, you'll grant us some measure of official power in the governance of Westeros?" Tywin nodded curtly. "That is the essence of it." A long silence settled. Oberyn pictured Elia's face. He pictured the last time he had seen her alive, radiant in King's Landing, before the sack that ended her life. He pictured the mountain's hulking corpse on the ground, blood pooling. He pictured the trembling relief of the Watchers when Gregor died. He thought of Tyrion's gratitude, of the small shift in Jaime's eyes, of Cersei's unwavering hatred. Finally, he weighed it all against the future of Dorne, the safety of his family, the chance for House Martell to wield genuine influence in a realm that had long slighted them. "You ask me to accept that you'll never confess or repent," Oberyn said quietly. "Very well. Perhaps that's the best we can expect in this world. But know this, Lord Tywin. If you ever raise a hand against Dorne, if you ever threaten Myrcella's well-being with your schemes, I will not hesitate to deliver another blow that you won't recover from." Tywin's gaze was ice. "Understood." Oberyn stood, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his dagger. "I'll speak to Prince Doran about these terms. We might send our conditions soon. Don't expect them to be meek." "I wouldn't," Tywin said, also rising. "The Martells have never been meek. But you do well to remember that House Lannister is not so easily toppled." With that exchange, Oberyn turned and strode to the door. Tywin did not stop him or say another word. Only the hush of the solar and the flicker of that pointless candle accompanied him out. In the corridor, Oberyn exhaled, feeling a swirl of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, fury at Tywin's arrogance, at his refusal to acknowledge the horror inflicted on Elia. On the other hand, a grudging respect for Tywin's willingness to strike a pragmatic deal. Perhaps Dorne could secure real power without more bloodshed. Perhaps that was a more meaningful vengeance in the long run, outmaneuvering the Lannisters in the political sphere, denying them the chance to treat Dorne as a subordinate. He still hated Tywin, but sometimes hatred had to be shaped into a more strategic form. He returned to Illyria, Obara, and Nymeria, confiding what had transpired in the solar. Illyria's eyes reflected his turmoil. So Tywin offers a deal but no apology, a purely transactional peace. "Yes," Oberyn said, sinking into a chair, feeling the weight of it. "I'll write to Doran again, outline Tywin's proposition. Dorne might have the chance to become an equal partner in the realm if we leverage the crown's financial desperation. That alone is a form of justice." Obara spit to the side, clearly displeased with any notion of letting Tywin off the hook. But she held her tongue, perhaps sensing her father's resolve. Nymeria placed a hand on Oberyn's shoulder. "If this can bring Dorne more power and the Lannisters less, maybe it's worth it." It might not satisfy the thirst for a confession, but life rarely gives us everything we want. Oberyn nodded. We'll see how Doran responds. That night, he penned another, more urgent letter to Doran, detailing Tywin's explicit offer. A seat on the small council, expanded trade rights, shared shipping lanes, and other boons, in exchange for Dorne's cooperation in stabilizing the crown's debts and ensuring Myrcella's safety as part of the betrothal. He couched it all in cautious language. If Tywin was truly ready to yield these concessions, Dorne stood to gain a foothold in King's Landing's governance for the first time in decades. In the days that followed, life in the Red Keep settled into an uneasy routine. Tommen and Marjorie's wedding celebrations concluded, and the city resumed its normal chaos. Tyrion busied himself with the crown's accounts. Jaime patrolled as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and Cersei hovered about, glaring at Oberyn whenever their paths crossed. Tywin kept his distance, waiting for a Dornish response. Meanwhile, the Sand Snakes discreetly watched for any sign of betrayal. At last, word arrived from Sunspear. Doran's response was meticulous and measured, carefully folded in a sealed scroll that a Dornish courier delivered to Oberyn. In it, Doran approved of pursuing negotiations with Tywin, though he laid out strict conditions. A guaranteed seat for a Dornish representative on the small council, the right for Dorne to oversee certain trade ports in the Stormlands, and a mutual defense agreement that recognized Dorne's autonomy. There was also a subtle hint that if the crown reneged on the deal, Myrcella's continued well-being could not be guaranteed. Oberyn brought the letter to Tywin in another private meeting. The old lion read it with stony concentration, then nodded curtly. "Acceptable. You'll deliver these terms to the king, or I will on your behalf." "We'll do it together," Oberyn said. "So there's no confusion as to who stands where." They proceeded to have a formal session with King Tommen in the throne room, though the Child King was far more interested in playing with Ser Pounce, his cat, than in discussing trade agreements. Nonetheless, with the presence of the small council, Cersei, Jaime, and a handful of other lords, an accord was struck. The crown recognized Dorne's right to more robust self-governance and trade, and Dorne pledged to support the crown's finances by opening its shipping routes for expanded commerce, and, in a pinch, to provide loans at fair interest rates if the Tyrell funding ever proved insufficient. The arrangement was sealed by each party's oath. For Dorne, it was not a perfect restitution for Elaya's murder, nothing could be, but it was a significant gain in status and security. In the days that followed, letters flew to and from Dorne to finalize the details. Oberyn and Ellaria prepared to leave King's Landing once again, this time under more amicable terms than before. The city still smelled of decay beneath the polished facade, and tensions simmered between the Tyrells, the Lannisters, the Faith, and the small folk. But for the moment, a fragile peace held. Oberyn was not naive enough to think it would last forever. Yet in that moment, Dorne had taken a step forward, secured a measure of justice in the form of power and recognition. And that, perhaps, was the best they could do without plunging the realm into another war. On the day of their departure, Oberyn met briefly with Tyrion and Jaime in a corner of the Red Keep's courtyard. Tyrion handed Oberyn a sealed letter. "My personal thanks," he said quietly. "Consider this a token of gratitude for your willingness to see a path other than open conflict. And for saving my life months ago, of course." Oberyn weighed the letter in his hand. "What is it?" "A set of leads on potential supporters for Dorne's new trade lines. Merchant houses, some from Essos, who might be amenable to forging connections with Sunspear. I've included a few of their contact details. Think of it as," he gave a crooked smile, "an investment in our future cooperation." Jaime nodded curtly. "I hope this peace stands, or at least, if conflict comes, we face it as equals. I've no wish to see the realm torn apart again." Oberyn slid the letter into his saddlebag. "Thank you both. We'll see where this leads." Not far away, Cersei stood watching, arms crossed, face unreadable. When Oberyn and Ellaria mounted their horses, the Queen Regent turned and strode back into the castle, offering no farewell. Tywin, for his part, made no appearance either. The old lion apparently preferred to remain behind the scenes, letting others handle the formalities. With Obara and Nymeria flanking them, and a dozen Dornish guards in tow, Oberyn and Ellaria rode out of the Red Keep's gates. The city parted around them, people calling out to the Dornish party, curiosity burning in their eyes. Some had come to see the Red Viper who once more left King's Landing alive and unscathed. Others wondered if the realm's newest arrangement with Dorne would quell the storms or only stir them differently. As Oberyn reached the King's Gate, he glanced back at the towering walls. Memories flashed of the trial by combat, the hush of the crowd, Gregor's monstrous figure dropping to the sand in a spray of blood. He tightened his grip on the reins. That day had changed everything. For him, for Dorne, even for the Lannisters, though Tywin would never admit it. Oberyn had not shattered House Lannister, but he had shown they could bleed. Now, ironically, he left the capital having forged an uneasy alliance. Ellaria rode beside him, the lines of concern around her eyes softening just a fraction as the fresh air outside the city gates embraced them. "Another victory of sorts," she said. "Not the vengeance we once dreamed of, but power gained in the end." "Aye," Oberyn agreed. "Dorne stands stronger than before. My sister Elia is still avenged by the Mountain's death. And if Tywin ever crosses us again, we have Myrcella, along with the official powers we've just secured. Perhaps that's enough for now." "More than enough," Ellaria murmured. "And if the day comes that House Lannister falls entirely, we can say we had a hand in loosening the stones." Oberyn couldn't help but grin at that. He looked down the long road that stretched south toward the Dornish marches. "Come, my love, let's go home." They departed, the sound of hooves echoing on the dusty roads, the Dornish banner flapping in the breeze. And so Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper, who had slain the Mountain and lived to tell the tale, carried back to Dorne the seeds of a new chapter. A tapestry of alliances and grudges still wove itself across Westeros, one that might one day see the downfall of Tywin Lannister or the rise of other powers. Yet for now, at least, Dorne returned home with its head held high, unbowed and unbroken. If Tywin thought to cage the Viper with bargains, he would soon learn that no cage holds a serpent forever. Thus did the months following Oberyn Martell's triumph over the Mountain shape a quieter but no less pivotal shift in the realm. The Lannisters had learned fear, the Tyrells questioned the cost of propping up the throne. The Iron Bank watched from afar with cold interest, and Dorne laid the groundwork for a future in which it would not bow to any lion. And above all, the memory of Elia Martell burned bright in Oberyn's heart. A reminder that though justice might take many forms, it would never be forgotten, nor would Dorne be denied the respect it had long been due. Over time, histories would record how Oberyn Martell came to King's Landing seeking vengeance and instead found a path toward power and influence that none had expected. Some might say he secured a lasting peace for Dorne. Others might argue he simply traded one danger for another. But in Dorne itself, the tale was sung as a victory. The Red Viper who slew the Mountain and forced Tywin Lannister to treat with House Martell on equal footing. Children in Sunspear learned to recite the story of how Prince Oberyn demanded justice, and though not all the old wounds were healed, the Martells emerged stronger, with their banner shining beneath the Dornish sun. Years would yet pass, and new conflicts and claimants to the throne would arise. Daenerys Targaryen across the sea with her dragons, the rumblings of rebellion in the north. But for that season, Oberyn Martell's decisive strike had bought his people time, leverage, and renewed pride. And so, riding away from the walls of King's Landing with Ellaria Sand at his side, Oberyn felt a cautious sense of fulfillment. He had tasted vengeance, survived the lion's den, and won a measure of justice for Elia's memory by crippling the Lannisters' unassailable mystique. No matter what else might come, no one could deny that the Red Viper had changed the game, and all of Westeros would feel the ripples of that change for years to come.